Chapter 1165. It really couldn't be covered at all. Li Nanheng lay on the bed with a headache, panting heavily. He just wanted Feng Ling to fall asleep as soon as possible so that he could go out and find a solution after she fell asleep. However, the little woman lying beside him rubbed her head against his chest, still staring at the obvious place under the quilt. "What are you looking at? Hurry up and go to sleep." The man's voice was hoarse and he raised his hand to cover her eyes. "Go to sleep." Her vision was suddenly blocked. Feng Ling was stunned for a moment, and then she raised her hand to pull his hand down. "Boss, don't cover my eyes." "Then close your eyes." "Boss, what's wrong there?" Li Nanheng closed his eyes. At this moment even the veins on the side of his neck were about to bulge. He forcefully pushed the little woman in his arms to the side, keeping her lying obediently by his side. "It's nothing. Be good. Go to sleep." After a moment of silence, Feng Ling finally didn't continue to speak, but she still lay on her side and looked at him. She no longer looked at his lower body, but she raised her eyes to stare at his face. Li Nanheng closed his eyes and ignored her, thinking that she had fallen asleep. Countless times in his heart, he wondered if there was anything that had a great impact on him. He wanted to find something to torture his mental state and take this opportunity to relieve the swelling pain down there. However, after thinking for a long time, what came to his mind was the scene that 3 years ago Feng Ling was thrown in front of the base hall by a group of people, lying on the ground, scolded coldly by Mr. Li and pointed at by everyone. All the things that belonged to her were thrown on the ground around her. She was in a sorry state but secretly gritted her teeth and did not shed a single tear. In the end, she was driven out of the base in a sorry state. After thinking about it for a long time, the biggest blow to him in recent years turned out to be that Feng Ling was driven out of the base alone. What was the reason? He clearly had the ability to not let her suffer that kind of harm. He clearly could have rushed back to protect her in his arms, not letting anyone spy on her and not letting anyone point at her, but he was not there at that time. The scenes in his mind not only did not divert Li Nanheng's attention, but his lower body did not show any signs of slowing down at all. It even made him want to hold the woman next to him tightly in his arms. He couldn't hold her. He had to endure it. Li Nanheng's eyes were still closed. Feng Ling lay by his side and did not close her eyes. She just looked at him and suddenly raised her hand. Her warm and soft fingers gently touched his lips. The man suddenly trembled and turned to look at her. His voice was so hoarse that he wondered if it was his own voice. "What are you doing?" Feng Ling abruptly sat up, searched her body for a while, and suddenly turned over to ride on him. Li Nanheng. He even looked at the little woman who suddenly rode on him in horror. She said she was riding, but in fact she just stepped over it. Then, she stretched her arms and found the coat she was wearing on the simple table beside the bed. She rummaged through the coat pockets and took out a wallet. Then she took out 2 bank cards. Li Nanheng was about to collapse. He silently counted down in his heart. If she still didn't go down, no matter if it was her period or if the soundproofing here was good, he would never let her go. Just as he counted from 10 to 6 in his heart, Feng Ling got off him and lay back by his side. Suddenly, she raised the 2 bank cards in her hand to him. Li Nanheng, who had just finished counting in his heart, was still in a state of half disappointment and half relief. When he suddenly saw the card she handed to him, he didn't react. "What is this?" "Feng Ling, it's for you. It's mine." Li Nanheng looked at the 2 cards. "Why did you give your card to me?" "Feng Ling, boss, you've always been in charge of my card and even took the time to help me manage my money. This is the money I've saved in the past 3 years. Boss, continue to help me manage it." Li Nanheng, seeing that he didn't move, Feng Ling grabbed his hand on the quilt and stuffed the card into his hand. "Take it." Li Nanheng held the 2 cards and looked at the little woman lying beside him. Although she was drunk, her eyes were clear and serious. "Why did you give it to me?" She had lived outside for several years and had learned how to live and how to manage her own money, hadn't she? "Feng Ling, because this is all I have." Li Nanheng, "Feng Ling, take it. Don't lose it." With that, she stuffed the card in his hand into his palm and then whispered in his ear, "There are more than 200,000 yuan in it." It was probably her so-called all of her that had stimulated the man. Li Nanheng was speechless for a long time. As the heir of the Li family, the boss of 11 Base, and the leader of the underground arms trade in the United States, he had more than 10 billion yuan behind him, but at this moment he felt that the bank card in his hand with more than 200,000 yuan was heavy as if it was the most important thing. He carefully clenched it. He couldn't listen to her anymore. Otherwise it would be difficult for him to restrain himself. He closed his eyes and pretended to be asleep, wanting her to be obedient and quiet down. However, Feng Ling, who usually spoke very little and would only reply to others word by word, was suddenly so agitated that it made people anxious. "Boss, go to sleep." "Boss." "Sleep? Boss you?" Li Nanheng couldn't bear it anymore. He suddenly turned over and pressed her under his body. His red eyes hid the man's excessive restraint and forbearance. "If you don't sleep now, even if you are on your period, I have 100 ways to make you unable to sleep. Shut up and sleep, Feng Ling." She stared at him blankly as if she understood something from his words, but also as if she didn't understand. Facing her eyes, Li Nanheng felt as if he was being fried in a pan of oil. He released her anxiously and was about to get up to leave. He really couldn't stay any longer. He had just propped up his arms on both sides of her body when suddenly, as if afraid that he would leave, Feng Ling raised her hands and wrapped them around his neck, pulling him down hard. Caught off guard, Li Nanheng fell back and hit her lips hard. More importantly, she took the initiative to raise her head and catch his kiss. She didn't know how to respond, but she still took the initiative to hold his neck and refused to let go. Li Nanheng did not move. He looked at the woman under him and saw that her eyes were wide open as though she was half awake and half intoxicated, but her eyes reflected his face. It was him. Only him. Pitter-patter. The last string of reason in his mind was broken. For him. Chapter 1166. Li Nanheng went crazy and pulled her hand down. When Feng Ling's hand instinctively shrank back because of the heat, he gasped. "You provoked me. If you don't vent your anger, don't even think about sleeping tonight." With that, the man leaned down and kissed her hard. This kiss, this urge that had been ruthlessly aroused, was uncontrollable. He didn't know if it was Feng Ling who gradually took the initiative to move his hand up and down, or if it was Li Nanheng who seduced her step by step and kissed her, teaching her how to make him more comfortable. When Feng Ling no longer needed his hand to hold her down, he had already held the woman tightly in his arms, hugging her, kissing her, and their lips and teeth were entangled. His mind was filled with thoughts. Just now, his rationality had been completely depleted. If it wasn't for the fact that his hand had touched the cushion on her when he reached down and regained his rationality by a fraction of a second, he might have done anything now. Suddenly, the man snorted, parted his lips and scolded hoarsely, "Why are you still biting me at this time?" In response to his dissatisfaction, Feng Ling's answer was that her hand didn't stop moving but bit his chin again. Right now, Li Nanheng couldn't stand her seduction at all. He directly pulled her hand away, lowered his head, and bit her lips hard. As he kissed, his saliva tangled and unclear sounds came from their lips. Vaguely, she could only hear a few vague words. "I won't be able to get out of bed for 3 days and 3 nights when I go back. You vixen. Do you want to kill me?" Feng Ling woke up in an urgent whistle. When she woke up, she was still a little confused and didn't know where she was for a moment. When her vision became clear and she saw that she was in her own compartment in the tent, she suddenly remembered and sat up. Because of the urgent whistle, she guessed that something big was going to happen or there was an urgent matter that needed to be gathered, so she quickly got up to change clothes and went out. However, when she was about to get out of bed, she suddenly paused and looked down at her clothes. The loose t-shirt didn't seem to change, but why didn't she remember how she came back last night? At first, it was Kay who asked her out for a drink. Then what? She was about to reach for her phone to see what time it was, but the moment her hand touched the phone, she suddenly felt sore. Not to mention her hand, even her wrist was sore. That feeling was just like when she was in the base. Nanheng would drag her out to do devil training at night, and she would stand on the shooting range holding a gun all night. She felt that her 5 fingers were sore and stiff, and she couldn't move them anymore. She clenched her fists back and forth. She couldn't remember what had happened, but she seemed to have held a gun in her dream last night. There seemed to be something wrong with the gun's handle. It was terribly hot, but she still held it for a long time. If it was a dream, then why was her hand so sore? The urgent whistle sounded again and again. Without thinking too much, she picked up her cell phone and took a look at it. Then she pulled up the black uniform, quickly put it on and rushed out. When she rushed out of the tent, she saw that many people were ready to go. She heard several acquaintances muttering as they ran outside. It seemed that there was a situation in the dense forest. In addition, the American police had arrived early. In order to get Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan out of danger in time, they immediately organized an emergency rescue team. But it was not early. The original plan was to go at noon, but it was almost 9 o'clock in the morning. She didn't expect that she would sleep so late. She must have drunk too much last night, but she didn't know if she was drunk in front of Kay or if she was particularly embarrassing. At this time, Kay came over and stood in a row with her. After the sniper team drill master assigned them weapons, he threw a new sniper rifle to Feng Ling and gave her a look of approval. He believed that even if she hadn't returned to the team for training in the past few years, with all her previous achievements, she would definitely be able to snipe from a distance. Feng Ling held the gun steadily and nodded to the drill master. At the same time, she adjusted the angle of the gun in her hand and checked everywhere. After confirming that there were no bullets in the gun, she carried the gun on her back, retracted her hand, and subconsciously lowered her head to look at her hand. Why did her wrist and hand still feel sore? Boss. Boss Li. Boss Li. When Li Nanheng's figure appeared in everyone's sight, Feng Ling also turned her head to look at him, but her eyes were cold and emotionless. She glanced at the man's face lightly, then retracted her gaze, lowered her head with a straight face, and tightened the belt under her combat uniform. Li Nanheng seemed to inadvertently glance at Feng Ling standing in the crowd. Because she lowered her head to adjust her belt, she couldn't meet his eyes, but the man's gaze swept in her direction wantonly, and then he withdrew his gaze in time before others noticed anything fishy, and coldly ordered everyone to prepare to board the plane and go to rescue. Feng Ling also boarded the plane with everyone. They had been stationed here for several days, and now they suddenly ordered the team to go to the rescue, which meant that they must have made sufficient preparations. But the helicopter she boarded was the same one as Kay's, and Li Nanheng, the rescue team of the American police, and the commanding army were in the front. Separated by the plane, even if she could hear everyone's conversation through the headphones, she could also speak at this time, but she didn't open her mouth the whole time. She only listened to Li Nanheng's cold and serious voice and did everything according to his instructions. After successfully flying into the center of the dense forest, everyone looked at a fixed electronic device in the cabin, on which various red dots showed the famous positions and the explosive range of the buried mines. Those were the points they needed to pay attention to, and then the position in the middle circled with bright yellow was the area where Akib and Dali were currently active. After confirming the target range of the helicopters in front and the position of the helicopters behind, everyone only said into the headphones, "Roger." Feng Ling also said. Her voice was very soft, but on the plane in front, Li Nanheng, who was on the other end of the headphones, still heard her voice among the nearly 100 people. In the headphones, she still had a cold voice that kept people thousands of miles away, but it was very recognizable among the men's voices. For M. Chapter 1167. Although Dali and Akib were well prepared and the artillery fire from below was frequent, since 11 base could rush in at this time, they must have designed a flight route. They avoided all the attacks and landed smoothly. All the members got off the helicopter with guns and started a fierce battle in this dense forest. After fighting for a while, Feng Ling was suddenly dragged aside by Tam and winked at her. "Hurry up and find Mrs. Mo and Mr. Mo. We'll take care of them." Mr. Mo would be fine. What she was afraid of was Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling nodded and stopped fighting. She got on the helicopter behind and began to search around with 2 members of the American police. After searching for a long time, she remembered that Mr. Mo had agreed with 11 base on the position signal. No matter when, the rendezvous point would be in the west. She didn't know if Mrs. Mo had already met with Mr. Mo, so she asked the American police to drive the helicopter west. Sure enough, in a slightly safer area near the dense forest minefield in the west, she vaguely saw Jin Wan standing behind a tree. "Stop, land here," Feng Ling shouted. When the helicopter landed smoothly, the police got off the helicopter first for fear of making any mistakes. Feng Ling also quickly got off the helicopter and went straight to Jin Wan. "Mrs. Mo." It sounded like Jin Wan was explaining her identity to the 2 American policemen. Feng Ling directly came forward to prove that she was on their side. The 2 policemen finally shut their mouths and did not continue interrogating Jin Wan. Feng Ling quickly stepped forward and grabbed Jin Wan's hand. "How are you? I'm sorry. We're late. We've been waiting for this batch of helicopters to rescue us. After all, the ambush here is very deep. If we don't make thorough preparations, we are likely to fail. But in the past 2 days, you must have suffered a lot." Before Feng Ling finished speaking, she looked at Jin Wan's pale face and bloody mouth and knew that she must have experienced a thrilling experience before this. She lowered her head and saw the back of Jin Wan's hand. Her heart trembled. How could her hand be hurt like this? It was a burn. Without asking more questions, Feng Ling took Jin Wan back to the helicopter. After getting in and making sure it was safe, she asked, "How did your hand get hurt like this?" "There is a medicine box on the plane. I'll help you deal with it. I'm fine." Jin Wan was taken into the helicopter. She finally relaxed a little but not completely. She turned to look out of the cabin in the direction that Mo Jingshan had just left and asked, "Where is Mo Jingshan?" Before Feng Ling flew over, she had been observing the situation on the ground. She did see Mr. Mo passing by unscathed and had already met up with the people in front. Mr. Mo is going to meet up with boss now. Don't worry, their plane is right in front, and the situation in front is under control. The minefields in this dense forest are likely to be detonated by those people. You are pregnant, so you can't smell the gunpowder. It's easy to hurt the baby. Come with me now. Although she didn't want to be separated from Mo Jingshan, she still sat in the helicopter obediently for the sake of the baby. Seeing Jin Wan's current state, although she wasn't covered in wounds, she definitely wasn't in a good state. Although she wanted to ask her what she had experienced these days, she looked very tired and didn't want to talk too much, so Feng Ling didn't ask much. Anyway, it was good to make sure she was safe. However, Jin Wan was in the helicopter. As the plane took off and landed very fast, she couldn't stand it. Her morning sickness worsened, so she ran into the bathroom in the cabin and vomited for a long time. In the end, Jin Wan was helplessly helped out by Feng Ling sitting in the cabin. Feng Ling took a soft electric and put it on her back. "Can you hold on? This helicopter is specially here to pick you up. I'll send you out right now. You'll feel much better after landing. Just bear with it." "I'm fine. It's just morning sickness." "I'm not sick," Jin Wan said weakly. "You don't have to send me out first. I'll wait for them with you." Feng Ling looked at her and didn't speak. She just helped her treat the wound on the back of her hand. Although she knew Jin Wan was very tired, the burn on her hand was really terrible, so she asked, "Is this a burn? Why is it so hot?" "I did it on purpose. They asked me to send him food and set up a trap. Whether he eats or not, it's the worst result. In order to prevent him from facing this choice, I spilled the whole pot of boiling soup on my hand," Feng Ling said in a low voice. Feng Ling paused and frowned. She had been in the base for a long time and was surrounded by men. In the years she lived outside, most of the women she knew were ordinary women who didn't have particularly good self-defense skills. It was more accurate to say that they didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken. But she had never seen someone like Jin Wan. She didn't have any martial arts skills, was just a simple and pure woman, and was even pregnant. But in her bones, there was a yearning for life and faith in life, as if there was a light, persistent and bright. "Maybe you should let Mr. Mo make the choice. He must have a way to protect himself without hurting you," Feng Ling said. Jin Wan was silent for a moment. "Yes, if I throw this problem to him, he may deal with it very carefully, but I didn't think so much at that time, so I used the stupidest method." "This is not a stupidest method. This may be a deep love. You'd rather be covered with scars than let the other party suffer any difficulties. Mrs. Mo, you've done a good job." When Feng Ling said this, she wrapped the gauze around her hand and suddenly remembered that in the Boston jungle, Li Nanheng was so injured that he couldn't even stand steadily, and even his breathing was irregular. However, when she was almost killed by those people, he still stood behind them with a gun like a god. He opened fire to help her. He stood there covered in wounds and didn't let her suffer any more injuries. Feng Ling had never figured out how Li Nanheng could still stand in that situation. How did he do it? At this moment, such a sentence suddenly burst out of her mouth. When she tied the gauze on the back of Jin Wan's hand, she couldn't help but tighten her hands. As if there was an answer in her mind. Li Nanheng's feelings for her were not limited to liking her, right? Or even love. Thinking of this word, Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. For M. Chapter 1168. Due to Jin Wan's insistence, the plane took off and landing in a safe spot in the middle of the dense forest. Seeing that Jin Wan was very tired, Feng Ling took care of her for a while and allowed her to rest in the cabin. Seeing that Jin Wan had fallen asleep, Feng Ling watched over her by the side. The sky gradually darkened. Mr. Mo came over. Feng Ling saw that Jin Wan had also woken up. After reminding her, she walked out, leaving the space for the two of them. The two of them had just been through a great calamity and survived a desperate situation. They must have a lot to talk about. It was really inappropriate for her to be here. After leaving the cabin, Feng Ling had been guarding outside the plane. From time to time, she would look at the fire and flashlight near the wooden houses not far away. Occasionally, when she heard some strange movements, she would subconsciously grip the gun behind her and look around coldly. After confirming that there were no problems, she retracted her hand and continued to quietly lay by her side. However, her fingers still paused slightly. Ever since she woke up this morning, there had been a strange feeling in her palm. That feeling was very strange. She lowered her head to look at her hand and felt that there was nothing special. She touched it with her hand and found that it was not hot. In the darkness of the night, the sounds of insects and birds chirping could be heard. Feng Ling placed her hand down and quietly guarded outside the plane. Not long after, Officer N suddenly sent someone over. Feng Ling then turned back to the cabin. The moment she entered, she abruptly saw that Mr. Mo had already taken off his blood-stained shirt. With just a quick glance, Feng Ling very consciously and decisively took a step back. She did not enter but stood outside to say, "Mr. Mo, Officer Entz, who is in charge of the American police this time, is looking for you." "Got it?" Mo Jingshan replied mildly. After a while Mr. Mo had put on his clothes again. He was still wearing the blood-stained black shirt, but Jinwan had helped him deal with the wound. Although the man's face seemed to be seriously injured, Mo Jingshan and Li Nanheng were actually the same kind of people. They both had high self-control and forbearance. No matter how serious and painful the injury was, they would not show any pain on their faces. He just walked out with indifferent eyes as if the wound on his body were not his. Seeing that Mo Jingshan had left, Jinwan was worried and was about to come out. Feng Ling couldn't let anything happen to her now, so she rushed over and blocked the cabin door. "Mrs. Mo, rest inside. Don't come out." Jinwan could only shrink her head back. After saying a few words to the two police officers outside, Feng Ling re-entered the plane. "Not going to sleep?" Seeing Jinwan still sitting there, she asked. "And?" Jinwan leaned against the wall. "Feng Ling, I feel like I'm watching a movie these days." Feng Ling smiled. "How can I see my hands covered in wounds while watching a movie? At least he survived, didn't he? At least Mo Jingshan is safe." "That's true." Feng Ling said lightly, "I've been on missions in the base these years and seen too many deaths. Being alive is indeed more important than anything else." Jinwan smiled as if she didn't want to talk about such a heavy topic in advance. However, because she knew that Li Nanheng and Feng Ling came to rescue together, she suddenly teased her about Li Nanheng. Then Jinwan mentioned the contraceptive pill in T-City last time. Feng Ling recalled the scene when Li Nanheng angrily pressed her against the door and bit her for a long time because of that contraceptive pill and said, "Forget it." Jinwan smiled. "I'm really curious about how you and Nanheng got along. You used to be brothers. What's the meaning of this?" Feng Ling was expressionless. "Now we're still brothers." "Really?" Jinwan smiled. "Why do I feel that you treat him as a brother but he treats you as his woman?" Feng Ling coughed and subconsciously changed the topic. "Mrs. Mo, your hand was wet just now, wasn't it? And? Why don't I disinfect your hand again?" "Forget it. It hurts." Jinwan put her hand behind her back. But Jinwan clearly felt Feng Ling's indifferent character. Although she didn't know what Feng Ling was like when she was in the United States, at least after meeting Feng Ling in High City, she found that as long as Li Nanheng was mentioned in front of her, she could only maintain her composure on the surface, but in fact she could see that she was a little irritable. Except for Li Nanheng, there seemed to be no one else who could make Feng Ling irritable. The matter in the jungle came to an end for the time being. On the way back, Jinwan and Mr. Mo were in this plane. Feng Ling was supposed to accompany and take care of them dutifully. After all, the two of them were injured, and when they were in High City, she had long been used to seeing them show off their affection every day. It didn't matter if she was a third wheel for a while. Anyway, as soon as they landed on the ground and returned to the camp, she would immediately disappear. But just before the plane was about to take off, as soon as she put on the headphones in the cabin, she heard Li Nanheng's voice. "Feng Ling, come to plane 1. Jinwan and Mo Jingshan didn't wear headphones, so of course they didn't hear it. Feng Ling turned her eyes to the two people who were still sitting there hand in hand and didn't know what they were talking about. Then she looked at the member of the police rescue team in the driver's seat. Before she spoke, she heard Li Nanheng's voice in the headphones again. "Don't dawdle. I'll give you 1 minute to arrive at plane 1. She didn't know why he suddenly ordered her to go there, but now even if she left, there shouldn't be any danger approaching Jinwan, so she put down the headphones and got off the plane. She quickly walked to the plane 1 where Li Nanheng took. As soon as she walked over, the cabin door suddenly opened. Looking at the open door, she stepped up. As soon as she entered, she saw that this plane 1 was obviously livelier than the ones behind it. Li Nanheng, Kay, and the others were all here, including the commander of the rescue team sent by China and Officer Entz from the United States. This helicopter was very large and could accommodate at least 17 or 18 people. Right now there were 7 or 8 people in it. It didn't look crowded, but it was indeed very lively. Feng Ling didn't understand why she was suddenly called here. After entering, someone came over to help her close the cabin door behind her. Li Nanheng was talking to Officer Entz. Hearing that she came, He turned to look at her and saw that she was standing there motionlessly. "Why are you standing there? We're about to take off. Aren't you afraid of falling? Come and sit down." With that, the man casually patted the seat beside him. Feng Ling looked at the others, walked over, and sat down in the seat he had just patted. When she sat down, she turned to look at Li Nanheng. When the man noticed her gaze, he lowered his eyes to look at her. Their eyes met. Although Feng Ling didn't speak, it was clear that there was a question in her eyes. Why did he call her to plane one? For M. Chapter 1169. Before she could ask, Kay suddenly said, "Aya, Feng Ling, is your EQ so low? Mr. Mo and Mrs. Mo just survived a desperate situation. The couple must have a lot of private things to talk about. Even if they don't treat you as an outsider when you're around, they must have some feelings that they can't express. You've been on plane 6. If Boss Lee hadn't called you over, would you have flown back with them on plane 6? Feng Ling, Mr. Mo's injuries are very serious. He doesn't seem to have much energy. Then the couple's lingering eyes are enough for you, okay? It's not dangerous. You don't have to guard Mrs. Mo all the time. Is it because of Mrs. Mo's disappearance a few days ago that you're traumatized?" Feng Ling didn't answer, but it was true. Last time it was in T-City. This time it was in Cambodia. Although there were reasons for Jin Wan's disappearance, in the final analysis, she believed that she should blame herself for not protecting Jin Wan well enough. It was her own lack of ability. She was indeed afraid that something would happen to Jin Wan again, but she didn't expect that these people thought she was an ignorant third wheel and even specially asked Li Nanheng to urge her to come over. She didn't speak again. After Li Nanheng finished speaking with Officer Entz, he smiled and shook hands with him. When he withdrew his hand, he directly sat on the seat on her side. The arrangement of seats in this helicopter was not the kind of small single seat. There were long and wide seats. Even the seats Mr. Entz and the others were sitting on were 2 sofa chairs along the cabin wall. The seat Feng Ling was sitting on was called a single seat, but it was not exactly. If 2 people really squeezed together, it could actually fit 2 people. Li Nanheng was now squeezing into her seat. The point was that he sat down next to her, and in order to make the 2 of them sit more comfortably, he put his arm on the back of the chair behind her casually. It looked like he was holding her in his arms, but the other people sitting here were not surprised at all. They just very consciously turned their heads away, chatting and doing their own things. "Feng Ling," she glared at the man beside her. Looking at her fierce face, Li Nanheng sighed in his heart. She was as obedient as a kitten after drinking too much last night. At that time she was so drunk that in the end she was very obedient and did whatever he asked her to do. She used her hands to help him toss around for most of the night without saying a word. Now that he was sober, he put on an unapproachable attitude. Li Nanheng casually placed his hand on her back and placed it on her shoulder. At the same time, his slender fingers gently flicked her shoulder. Feng Ling stared at him, clearly glaring at him, warning him not to mess around in front of so many people. However, on this side, Li Nanheng just squeezed next to her, half put his arm around her shoulder and only smiled. His smile made her feel a little strange. Strangely, she felt that her face seemed to be instinctively heating up. At this time the other people chatted as if nothing had happened. It was very obvious that no one would disturb them or pay attention to them. It was as if no one would interrupt them even if they casually talked about love. Feng Ling was about to speak, but at this moment the man lowered his head, leaned close to her ear and said in a voice that only she could hear, "You didn't sleep well last night. After getting up, you entered the dense forest. Are you tired?" Feng Ling's expression faltered and she glanced at him. "How do you know I didn't sleep well last night?" In order to prevent her from finding out that he had trained her last night, Li Nanheng casually turned to look at the night sky outside the cabin and said in a low voice, "I saw that you drank last night. When you went back you didn't sleep well. Who took off my clothes last night?" "You." The man lowered his eyes to look at her. "Do you think anyone else dares to touch you?" Seeing that he only took off her coat, Feng Ling endured it. Then she. The words were about to come out of her mouth, but she forcibly held them back. What should she ask? Did she do anything after drinking too much last night? She didn't know what she was like after drinking too much, but she didn't hear anyone mention anything, and it seemed that every time she drank too much, it was in front of Li Nanheng. She wondered what she did last night. What should she ask? Why did her hands feel so sore when she woke up in the morning? She vaguely thought of a possibility in her mind, but she felt that Li Nanheng shouldn't be so shameless. Yesterday Mr. Mo and Mrs. Mo hadn't been rescued yet. He shouldn't be so careless as to force her to do that kind of thing. Besides, the soundproofing here was not good, and the bathing environment was not good. But her hands were sore all day, and she really wondered what she did last night. What do you want to ask? Even though the man was sitting in the same seat as her, even though they were sitting side by side, he was still a little taller than her. He looked at her with his eyes lowered, and there was a hint of smile and eagerness in his calm eyes that others couldn't understand. After you sent me back to sleep last night, you left, right? Nothing happened? She didn't want to ask too directly, but she still wanted to ask if there was anything else she didn't remember. The answer the man gave her was to raise his good-looking brows. She couldn't move her eyes away for a moment until she heard him say, "What do you want to happen?" Then it should be that nothing happened. After all, in the morning she was still wearing her clothes, and her lower body didn't seem to be any different. She coughed and felt a little embarrassed by the man's gaze that was too close to her. She turned her head away from him and looked at Kay and the others, only to see that Kay and the others were chatting and hadn't looked in this direction. Looking at this woman who would deliberately keep a distance from him as long as she was sober, Li Nanheng was not anxious or annoyed. Anyway, last night when she was drunk, he had already learned everything he needed to know. Even if this girl put on a layer of disguise, she would always be transparent in front of him. He sat quietly by her side, and when he heard Officer Ence's words, he turned his eyes and talked to him mildly. Today they had fought in the jungle for half a day. Although they had captured all the people that should be captured, there were still 2 important people who had escaped. However, they couldn't escape this forest. It was estimated that there would be a fierce battle at any time, and they needed to return to the camp immediately to recuperate. Li Nanheng didn't continue to say more. He just held Feng Ling's shoulder in this posture and didn't let go for a long time. This posture couldn't be more natural, as if Feng Ling would stay by his side in everyone's eyes. For M. Chapter 1170. From Feng Ling's point of view, it didn't seem strange. It seemed that everyone knew it. It seemed that no one was surprised. It also seemed that everyone accepted it. There were no objections and there were no messy gossips. This made Feng Ling suddenly reconsider in her heart. In addition, Jin Wan occasionally hinted in front of her, which made Feng Ling feel that she should face up to the relationship between her and Li Nanheng. As a result, her body, which was a little stiff in Li Nanheng's arms, gradually softened and slowly relaxed. As if noticing the subtle change of the woman in his arms, Li Nanheng glanced at her calmly, only to see that she was sitting obediently by the side and didn't hide but just lowered her head thoughtfully. His lips curled up slightly, and his arms tightened on her shoulders. It was as though he had unintentionally pulled her body into his embrace, until he hugged her even tighter just like that. Probably because she suddenly relaxed, Feng Ling had been tense and didn't sleep much these days because of Jin Wan. Last night, she seemed to have fallen asleep after drinking, but she didn't sleep well and felt very weak all over. She felt both physically and mentally relaxed. The refreshing smell and sense of security of the man surrounded her, so she unconsciously leaned her head on the man's arm until she fell asleep. Kay and the others chatted, and when they looked back they saw that Feng Ling had fallen asleep. They immediately pointed in her direction, indicating that she had fallen asleep. The little woman's entire body suddenly softened and she leaned against him. How could Li Nanheng not notice it? He lowered his head to take a look and held her tighter. At the same time, he leaned down slightly so that she could rest more comfortably in his arms. In the eyes of others, these movements seemed as if nothing had happened, but only Feng Ling, who was half asleep, could sense the man's exquisite gentleness. Similarly, only Li Nanheng could feel her leaning more tightly in his arms and sinking deeper. Everything happened in a quiet state, but it seemed that there was something more silent than sound in their hearts. Feng Ling closed her eyes and let herself continue to sleep against him, and the man was willing to hold her like this. Seeing that boss didn't speak and didn't intend to carry Feng Ling to the temporary bed in the cabin next door to sleep, Kay simply stopped talking and continued to talk to the people next to him. The helicopter landed outside the dense forest. In order not to wake up Feng Ling, Li Nanheng winked at Kay and told him to take care of Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan. After all, Mo Jingshan was seriously injured and needed the 2 base doctors to help him deal with the injury on his back and the burn on Jin Wan's hand. However, since the contract between Dr. Wen and the base expired, the base hadn't found a particularly suitable doctor. Although the doctors who came with them were good, they were far inferior to Dr. Wen and Qin Sighting, so of course they had to be disinfected of time. They had to wait until they flew back to the United States to treat their treatment. After explaining everything, everyone else got off the plane, leaving only the 2 of them crammed into one seat in the spacious cabin. Li Nanheng didn't move, and Feng Ling gradually fell into a deep sleep. He just sat there and she had been quietly leaning against him. After a while the man moved slightly. He lowered his eyes to look at her sleeping face. He raised his hand and touched her cheeks, which were warm from her sleep. Indeed, it was time to sleep. She had been worried about Jinwan. If she didn't sleep now, she would probably have to help Jinwan after getting off the plane. Even if Jinwan would feel sorry for her and ask her to rest, with Feng Ling's character, she would never go to sleep until she saw that Jinwan was ready to sleep. Looking down at her for a long time, Li Nanheng slowly bent down, put one hand through her knees, and the other hand on her back, lifted her up. When Feng Ling was about to wake up, he suddenly lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "Go to sleep. Everything is safe. Have a good sleep." She didn't know if his words worked or if Feng Ling was dreaming, but after frowning, the man held her firmly in his arms. Her brows gradually relaxed and she continued to sleep. Even when the man carried her off the plane and walked past the base brothers who were shocked to the point their jaws almost dropped, she didn't wake up. Kay and the others were used to the things between Boss Li and Feng Ling. Even if they were curious and surprised, they didn't dare to show too much, but when the other brothers saw this scene, they all opened their mouths and stood there for a long time. When Boss carried Feng Ling into the tent, they gathered in groups of 3 or 5 and muttered, "Oh my God, Feng Ling has such a delicate side. There may be a fierce battle outside at any time and there are minefields all around, but she can still sleep so soundly," and she was carried out by Boss. Cough, for a man like Boss Li, any woman in his arms must be delicate, okay? Even Feng Ling is only a few centimeters taller than most girls. How tall is she? Is she 1.7 meters tall? Many female models are 1.8 meters tall. It's not surprising that she has such a delicate side in Boss's arms. Why isn't it strange? When has she ever treated Boss coldly? Our boss has almost been tortured by her to the point of having a deep hatred for her. But today she actually seems a little sweet? Boss has been chasing her for so long. It's time to get some benefits, right? Li Nanheng had already entered the tent with Feng Ling in his arms, leaving all kinds of whispers behind him, and carried Feng Ling all the way back to her small room. As soon as he walked into her room, the memories of last night came flooding back like a tide. The man's body also had a more obvious memory of this place. Thinking of the little woman holding his hand yesterday, Li Nanheng restrained himself on the surface and gently placed her on the bed. However, perhaps because this bed was still a simple folding bed, it was a little hard. At least, it was not as comfortable as in his arms. Perhaps Feng Ling subconsciously felt that she was back, so she suddenly opened her eyes. The man maintained the posture of putting her on the bed. Seeing that she woke up and even sat up abruptly, he pressed her shoulder lightly. "All right, don't get up. Go back to sleep. I've asked Kay to send hot water to Amo Jingshan. There are doctors in the base. You don't need to help. Now all you have to do is to sleep." Indeed, it's time for Li Cute to receive some benefits, right? I'm looking for monthly votes. I want to chat with more like-minded people about "The warm wind is not as deep as your love." I want to chat about life and find a bosom friend. For M. Chapter 1171. Feng Ling was really sleepy. She hadn't slept well in the past few days. Hearing his words and seeing the man's movements by the bed, she instinctively looked at his clothes and found that she had just been carried out of the helicopter by him. Since she didn't need to go to Mrs. Mo for the time being, she didn't have to worry about it anymore. Feng Ling didn't speak, closed her eyes and continued to sleep as he said, but when she fell asleep she gently pressed Li Nanheng's hand on her shoulder. Seeing her subtle movement, Li Nanheng sat by the bed with a faint smile on his lips. If it weren't for the fact that he really wanted her to have a good rest, he would have picked her up from the bed, held her in his arms and kissed her hard. No hurry. He could kiss her when she woke up. Taking advantage of the way she pressed his hand, the man simply sat by the bed and did not leave. Instead, he held her hand in his palm. Feng Ling was half asleep, but she did not pull her hand out. Instead, she peacefully closed her eyes and quietly allowed him to hold her hand and accompany her by the bed. For her, especially for her after 3 years, this was a big step forward. Even if it was a very subtle change, Li Nanheng could feel her heart. Feng Ling turned over slightly and tilted her head inwards, but she didn't pull her hand out of his palm. Looking at her sleeping posture, Li Nanheng stretched out his other hand to push back the loose hair that covered her eyes and brows. "Go to sleep. After we leave Cambodia, things will come to an end." Feng Ling didn't speak. After a while, she breathed evenly again and really fell asleep. The next day, Dolly, who had escaped in the chaos, set up an ambush in the jungle. Early in the morning, Mo Jingshan rushed to the jungle, and all the people in the camp were ready to go in to rescue the 8 poor children who had been kidnapped. When Feng Ling learned of the situation, she wanted to go with them, but before boarding the plane, Li Nanheng told her to stay here to protect Jinwan today and not to go inside to help. As long as she protected Jinwan, there would be no problem on Mo Jingshan's side. Knowing the seriousness of the matter, Feng Ling certainly believed in the strength of the other brothers of 11 Base. She looked back and saw Jinwan hurriedly coming out because she noticed the situation and went over to stop her. "Mrs. Mo, don't go there. A large area of minefield in the jungle has been detonated, and there will be continuous explosions. They have to go in to deal with the aftermath. You don't have to worry about it." "Then what are they going to do?" Jinwan noticed Mo Jingshan's serious eyes and was worried about his injury. Then he saw the rest of the people in the camp getting on the helicopter. Looking at the situation, it was no different from yesterday. It seemed like a tough battle was about to be fought. Did something happen inside? "I heard that their leader, the one called Akib, escaped." "Yes, but they won't be able to escape from this forest." Feng Ling briefly told Jinwan what she had just learned. After all, there was no way to hide anything now. The more she hid, the more it would cause Jinwan to speculate and panic, so she could only tell the truth. Mr. Mo went straight into the helicopter with his injury. Jinwan stared at him. Feng Ling knew she was uncomfortable, but she still had to stand in front of her. In fact, Feng Ling had come into contact with Akib and Dali's methods before. Their despicable and shameless actions often targeted innocent women and children. The fact that Mr. Mo had gone there with injuries showed how bad this matter was. Although Feng Ling firmly believed that the brothers of the base could wipe them out, she was still a little worried. After all, she was not at the scene and women were naturally prone to worry. Just as Feng Ling was about to drag Jinwan back to the tent and take her inside to rest, Jinwan looked at the key on her waist and said, "I'm good at driving and I've always been very flexible in controlling the direction. I heard that this kind of helicopter is not as complicated as a civil airliner. Do you think I can drive it?" Feng Ling didn't expect that Jinwan, who had no fighting ability at all, would have such courage after experiencing the thrilling events of the past few days. She paused. "Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Feng Ling, my man, is there." Jinwan had experienced a life-and-death crisis. Now, no matter whether she was alive or dead, she had just reunited with Mo Jingshan. It had only been one night and she had to face separation again. She absolutely couldn't bear it. Separated by this dense forest, she felt tormented even for 10 minutes. Besides, Mo Jingshan's injury was too serious. "Oh, your man is also there." Feng Ling was not impulsive, but she remembered what Li Nanheng said last night, sitting by her bed, that as long as they left Cambodia, this matter would come to an end. Indeed, after leaving they would be safe, but could they leave safely? It was said that one of the 8 children had been killed, and the others were injured. Mr. Mo would rush to save them regardless of the injury on his back. With Li Nanheng's temper, he would definitely take the responsibility. There were so many innocent children. If he was really desperate, it was not impossible for him to exchange his life for another's. The 2 women stood in the tent. Finally, one day, because of Jinwan's gaze, the words swayed by emotions were transferred to her head. Feng Ling was swayed by her emotions. So she took Jinwan straight into the dense forest. However, Feng Ling didn't expect that in this well-planned encirclement, she and Jinwan became the 2 people who Dali and Akib miscalculated. Especially Jinwan, a woman who had never held a gun before, stood at the back of the crowd. The unexpected shot broke the deadlock in the dense forest, giving 11 Base and the police rescue team the best opportunity to besiege them. After finally solving the tricky situation, Feng Ling glanced at the back of Li Nanheng, who was going to rescue the children with Officer Entz. She turned around and was about to take Jinwan back to the helicopter, when she suddenly saw Mr. Mo angrily take Jinwan to the helicopter and teach her a lesson. Hearing Mr. Mo scolding Jinwan, Feng Ling was actually a little embarrassed. Today it was not only Jinwan who was emotional but also she. However, there was a sudden bang in the air. A gunshot. Everyone ignored Akib, who had already fallen to the ground. He was covered with blood and his eyes were bloodshot, but he pretended to be dead. If Mr. Mo hadn't dodged in time with Jinwan in his arms, the bullet would have hit the metal wall outside the helicopter, or the consequences would have been unimaginable. Thankfully, Feng Ling was standing close at that time. She abruptly fired and hit Akib's wrist. She then expressionlessly walked toward Akib step by step and shot him all over his body. Akib's body was riddled with holes, his entire body twitched, and he completely breathed his last breath. Chapter 1172. Although this journey was not very dangerous, it was really tiring to be stationed near Tunnel Sap Lake for a few days. After flying back to Los Angeles, they returned to the base. Feng Ling and Li Nanheng guarded the hospital with Kay and the others, and 11 Base sent some people to take turns to protect Mr. Mo and Mrs. Mo outside the ward area. Mr. Mo was seriously injured, but fortunately the wounds were on his back and there were no fatal wounds. However, according to Kay's description, it was said that Mr. Mo's back was dripping with blood. She didn't know what he had experienced in the jungle. Feng Ling felt sorry to see the burns on Jin Wan's hands every day. There were people taking care of Mr. Mo, so she seldom went there. She just accompanied Jin Wan, bought food for Jin Wan, and stayed outside her ward every day. She basically didn't need to do other things for the time being. After all, although she was in Los Angeles now, she was still Jin Wan's bodyguard, which was her main duty. Jin Wan went to Cambodia in a hurry and didn't bring any clothes. After coming back from there, she just bought 2 sets of clothes. Now she was in the hospital and it was not convenient for her to change. While Jin Wan was accompanying Mr. Mo in his ward, Feng Ling went to the largest department store nearby to help buy some clothes and various skincare products that Jin Wan could use. However, Feng Ling had never used skincare products, and she remembered that Jin Wan seemed to use them very little. She stood in front of a skincare product counter, holding a bottle of essence and moisturizer recommended by the counter sister in her hand. She stared at it for a long time but didn't understand it. The counter sister boasted about the efficacy of these skincare products for a long time, but she didn't understand it. She felt that all the advertisements on the side of the counter had the same efficacy. They all seemed to be magical and seemed to be able to rejuvenate. Feng Ling put down the things in her hand and turned back to continue to wander back and forth on the first floor of the department store. She didn't know much about these skincare products, but with how much Mr. Mo doted on Mrs. Mo, he would definitely buy the best for her. She didn't know which one was the best, so she just walked in front of each counter, trying to see if there was a more expensive one, but it turned out that there were more expensive ones. Even a thumb-sized bottle cost thousands of yuan. She looked all the way and found that there was no most expensive one but more expensive one, and there were even more expensive ones that cost tens of thousands of yuan. At this time, Feng Ling finally understood what the brothers in the base meant when they teased each other that finding a girlfriend was too expensive. She also understood why Ling Feifei would slap a bunch of skincare products on her face every day when she accompanied Jin Wan in T-City. She would also discuss skincare products with others and look at her complacent eyes. Jin Wan had once said, "Feng Ling, it's not like you're not beautiful. In fact, you can grow your hair a little longer and try to slowly live like a woman. Women don't need to be delicate, but you can't miss out on a woman's most beautiful years. Although short hair is also very beautiful, a woman has to experience long hair at least once in her life. She can't always treat herself as a man. She has to adapt to life as a woman bit by bit." At that time, Feng Ling just gave a faint smile and didn't take these words to heart. Now looking at these skincare products and then looking at the fragrant young girls walking past him, he found that the perfume on each of them seemed to be different. The skincare products, cosmetics, and even the color of their lipsticks seemed to be different after a closer look. It seemed a bit difficult to be a woman through and through. Feng Ling stood in front of a very expensive skincare product counter full of blue and gold bottles. Listening to the saleswoman bragging for a long time, she had to buy a few bottles casually and some facial masks by the way, preparing to take them back to the hospital for Jin Wan to use. As for herself, forget it. She felt that it was more difficult to learn to be a woman than to go back to T-City to memorize business management formulas. Carrying the skincare products she had just bought, Feng Ling went upstairs and planned to buy a few more sets of clothes for Jin Wan. Walking around the mall, considering that it was cold outside, she looked around at the coats. Jin Wan liked to wear cashmere coats, which were warm and very suitable for her figure and temperament. Feng Ling had just walked into a brand store and was looking at a white coat inside, when suddenly she saw a middle-aged woman coming out of the fitting room. "Mrs. Feng, don't worry. This coat is very warm." The shop assistant accompanied the middle-aged woman out of the fitting room and chatted with her with a smile on her face. At the moment when Feng Ling turned around, the middle-aged woman also noticed that someone else seemed to have entered the store and subconsciously raised her eyes to look. Their eyes met and Feng Ling recognized that it was Mrs. Feng, Qin Qiu. Recently, Qin Qiu's physical condition was not very good. Especially after Feng Mingzhu's accident in China, she was particularly noisy at home every day, and the Feng family worried about her every day. As a mother, Qin Qiu usually didn't care much about the family affairs, and her eldest daughter was also unruly. Except for the two elders of the Feng family who could suppress Feng Mingzhu's temper when they really got angry. Although Qinxiu was a mother, she couldn't control her daughter, but it didn't mean that she didn't worry about her. Recently, the weather had been cold, and Mrs. Tsin, who was a family friend of hers, invited her out to see if there were any new coats sent from Paris this autumn and winter. It was nothing more than two elderly women going out for a walk. Qinxiu was indeed bored at home for many days and wanted to go out for a walk, so she simply came out. However, she had caught a cold a few days ago and her throat was still hoarse. The moment she saw Feng Ling, her eyelids suddenly twitched. Back then, when she saw Feng Ling dressed in men's clothes, she didn't have any special feelings. At this moment, looking at Feng Ling, who was dressed in black sportswear but didn't deliberately dress up as a man, Qinxiu's hand that was holding the coat froze fiercely. "Mrs. Feng, are you sure you want this coat? Mrs. Tsin is still trying on another coat inside. Do you want to wait until she comes out and pay the bill or?" The saleswoman's words were still ringing in her ears, but Qinxiu didn't hear it at all and only stared at Feng Ling. When facing this Mrs. Feng, Feng Ling's heart was calmer than she thought. After all, just two jade pendants that could be clasped together could not completely prove anything. Although her guess was more than half likely before the coffin was sealed, she could not be sure whether this Madame Feng was her mother or not. Chapter 1173. Moreover, Feng Ling wasn't ready to face her real identity. Qinxiu's eyes were glued to her. No matter how slow Feng Ling was in understanding people's emotions, she could tell what the excitement in Qinxiu's eyes was. Feng Ling withdrew her gaze, pretended not to see it and turned to walk out. "Wait a minute." Seeing that she was about to leave, Qinxiu suddenly called her with an excited and even shrill voice that she had never made in more than 10 years. She threw the coat in her hand back to the shop assistant and walked quickly over. Before Feng Ling was about to step out, she suddenly stepped forward and held her arm. "Child, wait a minute. Don't go." Qinxiu held her back. Even though she was sick, cold, and weak at this moment, she only felt that her whole body was full of strength. She was able to stop Feng Ling, who was very skilled and stable, from using too much force. Then she grabbed her arms with both hands and stood in front of her, looking at her face, looking at her hair that had grown longer than a few years ago, and then lowering her head to look at the outline of her body that belonged to a girl. Suddenly being scrutinized from head to toe by Madame Feng, Feng Ling stood rooted to the spot and watched this slightly agitated woman. Feng Ling, who had never thought of delving into her own background and had never thought of acknowledging her as a relative, felt as though her heart had been ruthlessly pierced by something. She could have pushed her away expressionlessly and then politely said that she had something to do. She could have avoided all the topics, but when she saw Mrs. Feng's eyes and felt the strength of her hand on her arm, she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. "Child?" The more she looked at her, the redder Qinxiu's eyes became, and the more her voice trembled. "You're Feng Ling, right? The Feng Ling of 11 base? The Feng Ling I met a few years ago? It's you, right?" In just a few years the teenager had become like this. She was still as exquisite and beautiful, but she was obviously taller than a few years ago. She was no longer a young boy but a tall and beautiful girl. A girl with short hair, a cold and indifferent temperament, and a very beautiful girl. Feng Ling's arm was about to hurt from her grip, but it was as though she could not feel the pain. She looked at the agitated Madame Feng in front of her and composed herself before answering, "It's me." Qinxiu's tears were about to fall. Back then she had unintentionally heard those words at the same time as her mother. At that time, Feng Mingzhu had said that Feng Ling was a woman disguised as a man in 11 base. At that time her heart trembled. She kept thinking about the face of the child named Feng Ling, thinking that the boy who didn't speak much and was somewhat cold was actually a girl. However, when he thought about how she was 1 year younger than his daughter, and how could there really be any miracle in the vast ocean? After that, she never saw Feng Ling again. Although she was worried and suspicious, she didn't have the chance to confirm anything. But today she saw it. With just one glance, even though Qinxiu had doubts about Feng Ling's age, she could clearly feel that between the child's brows, there was not only the shadow of herself when she was young, but also the shadow of her husband when he was young. Only the closest people would be able to see the resemblance between this child's appearance and her husband's. If it was just her, it would be fine. But her husband, Feng Mingzhu's father, even Feng Mingzhu didn't look so much like him, but Feng Ling looked very much like him. They were two alike. Seeing that Feng Ling was standing in front of her and did not speak or move for a long time, perhaps frightened by her, Qinxiu hurriedly restrained her emotions and withdrew her hand. However, as though unwilling to part with her, She hurriedly reached out to hold Feng Ling's hand and held it tightly in agitation. "Feng Ling, don't be frightened by Auntie. Xiao, what's wrong?" At this moment, Madame Tsin had finished trying on the clothes and walked out. When she saw Qin Xiu holding onto a young lady's hand, she immediately walked over with a strange expression. Her gaze landed on Feng Ling's face and she immediately turned to look at Qin Xiu in confusion. Madame Tsin and Madame Feng were family friends and had known each other for many years. Madame Tsin had seen Qin Xiu when she was young. She recalled how Qin Xiu would always be so agitated whenever she saw someone who resembled her. She had long gotten used to it. However, it was truly rare to see someone who resembled her so much. "You guys chat. I'll go pay for the coat you were interested in," Madame Tsin said, and did not disturb them anymore. She directly went inside to pay the bill. Qin Xiu nodded, but her gaze never left Feng Ling's face. Her hand continued to hold onto Feng Ling's hand tightly. "Don't just stand there and not speak. Can you talk to Auntie? Can you talk?" Feng Ling stood there for a long time. She wanted to free her hand, but it was held too tightly. When she saw Madame Tsin's gaze, she could not bear to do so. After a long while she finally said, "Madame Feng, you're a little agitated. Do you want to calm down first?" She was so agitated that her hand was almost sweating. When Qin Xiu heard her words, she sobered up and quickly released her hand. When she lowered her head to see that the back of Feng Ling's hand was red, she immediately felt apologetic. She tried her best to control her emotions and took a step back. She smiled and said, "Don't be frightened by me. It's just that Auntie hasn't seen you for many years. After all, we've known each other for so many years." Feng Ling did not speak again. "Oh, by the way, have you eaten?" "I've eaten." Qin Xiu clenched her hand and looked at her without blinking. "Then, can Auntie treat you to a cup of coffee?" Feng Ling was about to speak when her cell phone suddenly rang. She nodded politely to Madame Feng and Qin Xiu hurriedly said, It's okay. Answer the phone. I won't disturb you. Let's talk after you answer the phone." Feng Ling picked up the cell phone and saw that it was Li Nanheng. She was a little helpless because of Madame Feng, but strangely she suddenly calmed down. She picked up the phone and put it to her ear. "Boss, where are you?" "I came out to buy clothes for Mrs. Mo." "Where? Was he coming over? Didn't he need to discuss things with Mr. Mo in the hospital?" "That was right." Now Mrs. Mo was in Mr. Mo's ward. Li Nanheng must have been stuffed with dog food and couldn't stay there any longer. Feng Ling said, "In the department store nearest to the hospital. The signal on my cell phone is on. You can find the location." "All right, I'll go over." After hanging up the phone, Feng Ling turned her eyes, only to see that Madame Feng Qin Xiu was still standing there. She seemed to be watching her as she answered the phone just now. Her eyes were full of hope and she kept looking at her. "Ask for monthly votes, babies. Heart to heart." Chapter 1174. Madame Feng. Feng Ling looked at her. "In a moment Boss Li will come over. You two should be considered old acquaintances." Hearing Feng Ling mention the so-called Boss Li, Madame Feng's thoughts remained on her. She did not think much about it. She then saw Feng Ling's female sportswear and recalled that Li Nanheng and Feng Ling seemed to be very close in the past. Right now this was not 11 base but a department store. Feng Ling was shopping here and Li Nanheng actually came over. So, between Feng Ling and Li Nanheng, thinking of that somewhat absurd marriage, Qin Xiu's eyes brightened. She looked at her with a smile. "All right, I haven't seen Nanheng for a long time. Let's go for a cup of coffee. Auntie's treating okay?" Madame Feng's tone was too gentle, and there was a hint of caution in it. It was as though she was subconsciously afraid that Feng Ling would refuse and scare her away. Feng Ling really did not know how to face the situation. However, since Li Nanheng would come over, her heart was much more at ease. Seeing Madame Feng's fearful gaze, she finally nodded. "All right." Qin Xiu instantly smiled. "Then let's go across the street. There's a cafe opposite this department store. The environment is not bad. The environment is elegant and quiet." Feng Ling nodded lightly. Seeing her so gentle, quiet, and seemingly calm and obedient, Qin Xiu's eyes were almost filled with tears. However, she was really afraid of scaring this child and forced herself to hold back. However, her eyes could not leave Feng Ling's face. If she was really her daughter, then the heavens really treated her too well. But what if she wasn't, if it was just a coincidence that they looked alike? After all, even an adult would have a hard time coming out alive after falling into the vast sea. How could a little 1-year-old child really have a miracle? After Madame Tsin paid the bill for Madame Feng, she walked out with 2 bags. She leaned close to Madame Feng and whispered something. Madame Feng nodded and then shook her head, as though she was unable to suppress her emotions in front of an old sister she had known for many years. However, in the end she still forcefully suppressed her emotions and said in a low voice, "I do look very similar to me when I was young, right?" Madame Tsin turned to Feng Ling and replied in a low voice, "They really do look alike. No wonder you're so agitated. In the past, whenever you saw a child who looked like you on the streets, your emotions would fluctuate for a long time. Now that you've met someone who looks so much like you, AI? But no matter how much they look alike, they're not your own children. 20 years have passed. It's time to let go." Qin Xiu's eyes suddenly fell on Feng Ling. "Child, how old are you this year?" Although he had asked this question a few years ago, it was as if he wanted to confirm something at this moment. Facing the woman who might be her mother, Feng Ling didn't know whether to tell the truth or to tell the truth about the fake birthday that had been written on her identity card. "I am past 20, she answered. "Over 20? Then, are you 21 years old?" Qin Xiu's eyes trembled as she watched her. It was as though there was a thin needle right in front of her, hanging on the edge. With just a gentle blow it might fall off completely, but it might also not fall off. Her gaze and her tone were so careful that Madame Tsin, who was by the side, felt her heart ache for her. She could not bear to say another word. 21 years old? Was she already past 21 years old? Feng Ling was stunned. Before she could answer, Madame Tsin's phone rang. Madame Feng abruptly returned to her senses when she heard the ringtone. She immediately felt that she had been too abrupt. She had chased after a young lady and asked all sorts of questions. Anyone in her position would be stunned. Madame Tsin turned to answer the call. Madame Feng smiled at her. "I just like you very much. I might have asked too many questions. Please don't mind it." "I won't." Feng Ling saw the caution in her eyes and could not bear to continue. "I just don't know how to answer you. I don't even know when my birthday is." The emotions that Madame Feng had just suppressed and had just regained some calmness were instantly thrown into turmoil. She resisted the urge to continue interrogating her. She only stared at her. "You?" Feng Ling looked at her sincerely. "Madame Feng, before I entered Ping 11 base I lived in an orphanage. They only recorded a temporary birth date for me. As for my actual birthday, I'm not sure." Qin Xiu's hands trembled. She stared at Feng Ling for a long time. Finally, Madame Tsin returned from the call. She stood by her side and said, "My son is here to pick me up. You have something to talk to this girl about, right? I'll be leaving first. Here are the clothes. You can take it as my repayment for the car repair fees you paid for me previously." After speaking, Madame Tsin saw that Madame Feng was still standing there in a daze. She shook her head and stuffed the bag of clothes into Madame Feng's hands. She then turned to speak to Feng Ling. "Little girl, don't be frightened by her. She's always been like this all these years, but I've never seen her so excited before. I can tell that she likes you very much. Why don't you accompany her for a while longer?" Feng Ling did not speak. She only nodded at Madame Tsin. After Madame Tsin left, Qin Xiu gripped the bag in her hands tightly. She took a deep breath and suddenly smiled. "What are the two of us standing here looking at? Let's go to the cafe now?" "All right." Qin Xiu forcibly shifted her gaze away from her face. She turned and headed for the elevator. However, her movements were somewhat flustered. Something in her mind reminded her countless times. Feng Ling was a girl. She was an orphan. She had no parents. She did not know when her birthday was. She looked so much like herself and old Feng. This child's gentle and indifferent personality was extremely similar to her family's old lady when she was young. If it wasn't for the plastic bag in his hand, which blocked the strength of his nails, he wouldn't have been able to pinch anything for a long time. Otherwise, if he had clenched his hand too tightly, his nails would have pierced into his palm and bled. Just as the two of them walked out of the department store and were about to cross the bridge to the cafe across the road, at the foot of the stairs, Mrs. Feng, who had been staring ahead and thinking about something, suddenly tripped and almost fell. Feng Ling quickly stepped forward to support her. "Be careful." Suddenly, Feng Ling took the initiative to support her. Qin Xiu abruptly turned to look at her. When she abruptly saw Madame Feng's hopeful gaze, Feng Ling was momentarily at a loss. She was used to being free and did not wish to acknowledge her family. Regardless of whether she was related to the Feng family or not, she had no intention of acknowledging her parents. But wasn't she being too selfish by doing this? What if her family had always been looking for her? What if she wasn't abandoned? What if she was the quickest to read? Chapter 1175. Afterward, Feng Ling supported Madame Feng as they walked across the bridge. Even though Madame Feng did not sprain her ankle and walked steadily, Feng Ling's hand continued to support her and did not let go. Madame Feng did not ask her to move her hand away. As she walked, she seemed to be thinking about something. Suddenly, a smile appeared in her eyes. When they were about to enter the cafe, she suddenly gently held Feng Ling's hand on her arm and said warmly, "Find a seat by the window. It'll be easier for Nanheng to see you when he comes looking for you." "All right." Feng Ling only agreed. Madame Feng glanced at her with a smile and led her in. After sitting down, Madame Feng ordered 2 cups of coffee from the waiter. One was an Americano and the other was a latte. Of course the latte was for Feng Ling. She guessed that Feng Ling probably did not drink much coffee in the base and would not be used to bitter coffee. A latte was more suitable for her. All these years, Feng Ling did not know much about coffee. The only thing she could drink was a latte. However, she did not expect that Madame Feng, who appeared to be gentle and without any ideas, was actually so meticulous. "Do you like to eat desserts?" Qin Qiu asked her. "It's all right. I've eaten earlier and am not very hungry. I'll pass on the dessert." However, before she could finish speaking, Madame Feng called the waiter who had yet to leave. She ordered a chocolate cake and, after thinking for a moment, a blueberry cake. When the waiter quickly brought the coffee and cake over, Feng Ling thought that she wanted to eat too. However, Madame Feng pushed the 2 cakes in front of her. "I've tried all the cakes in this cafe. These 2 taste very good. You can eat whichever you like. There's no need to stand on ceremony with Auntie." So, a woman of Madame Feng's age also frequently came out to eat desserts? Thinking of Madame Tsin, Feng Ling felt that if Madame Feng hadn't lost a daughter and been depressed for so many years, she would have been a very energetic and happy woman. She could tell just by looking at the personalities of her good friends. Even though they were getting on in years, she could tell that they were very open-minded. "Thank you, Madame Feng. Don't always call me Madame Feng. It's too distant." At this moment, Feng Ling's gaze was attracted by the 2 small cakes in front of her. She habitually reached out to the blueberry-flavored cake. She had just used a small fork to pick up a blueberry stained with cream when Feng Fu's gaze was fixed on her. Feng Ling paused under her gaze. She raised her eyes to look at her. "Madame Feng, aren't you going to eat? You like blueberries?" Feng Ling. From this conversation, Madame Feng's eyes seemed to have caught on to some common ground. Even if Feng Ling wasn't too sure about the relationship between the 2 sets of jade, she was now 80 to 90% certain that it was the case. "You like to eat blueberries." If Madame Feng did not restrain her emotions, she should have added the word "also." Yes. Feng Ling did not lie and directly admitted it. At the same time, she moved the blueberry cake over and placed it in front of her. She calmly admitted, "I don't particularly like desserts, but I do like blueberry-flavored desserts." Madame Feng watched her for a long time. Watching Feng Ling lower her head to eat the cake, her eyes first brimmed with tears, and then she suddenly smiled. She suppressed her choking voice and said with a smile, "It's good that you like it. You can eat as much as you want. Auntie will buy it all for you. Whatever you like, I'll buy it for you. In the future, can you come out often to sit with Auntie and eat together, to chat with me?" Feng Ling's hand that was holding the fork paused. The sweetness in her mouth had yet to subside. She did not raise her eyes. She was afraid that if she raised her eyes to meet Madame Feng's gaze, her heart would immediately soften to the point where she could no longer control her emotions. Seeing that she lowered her head and did not speak, Madame Feng picked up the coffee and took a sip. The bitter taste calmed her down. When she placed the cup down, she softly said, "I mean, sir, how many people?" All of a sudden, the door of the coffee shop opened and closed. The waiter's voice came from the other side. "There's no need. I'm looking for someone." A man's clear and indifferent voice followed. Feng Ling and Madame Feng simultaneously turned toward the direction of the voice. They saw that Li Nanheng had already seen them at the door. He first glanced at Feng Ling and then politely nodded to Madame Feng. He directly walked over with long strides. In the past 2 days after returning from Cambodia, she had not had the opportunity to sit down with Li Nanheng to talk. It was rare to see him in such an environment where there was nothing to deal with. Feng Ling subconsciously pursed her lips. She did not know why, but her heart rapidly thumped several times. Especially when the man walked to this table, his eyes were fixed on her. He did not shift his gaze away from her as he walked over. "Nanheng, sit." When Madame Feng saw Li Nanheng, her mood became even better. She pointed to the seat beside Feng Ling. "You're not an outsider. Sit there." Feng Ling did not pay much attention to how many layers of meaning were contained in the words "not an outsider." Li Nanheng glanced at Madame Feng and did not say anything. He only slightly curved the corners of his lips and easily sat down on the empty seat beside Feng Ling. "Indeed, you're not an outsider." Feng Ling did not know that Li Nanheng already knew about her identity. She only thought that he was saying that she had been in 11 base for so many years and had always been one of them. "Do you want to drink coffee?" Feng Ling turned to ask him. Li Nanheng casually unbuttoned the 2 buttons on his coat and casually sat down by her side. He glanced at her and suddenly, with a hiss, sat slightly closer to her. Feng Ling thought that he was hurt somewhere and was about to ask, but the man suddenly leaned over and raised a finger to wipe the corner of her mouth. "You can even wipe cream on the side of a cake. You're really promising." Feng Ling. Perhaps because Madame Feng was sitting opposite and watching them, Feng Ling, who was usually used to Li Nanheng's passionate attitude, suddenly felt her face burning. She abruptly raised her hand to wipe the corner of her mouth, but he had already wiped it clean and there was nothing. She could only put down her hand, but for a moment she did not know where to put her hand. Even if they wanted to show off their affection, they should look at the occasion, okay? Madame Feng was still here, and this coffee and cake was also Madame Feng's treat. Feng Ling secretly gave him a look, indicating for him to not sit so close to her, to sit further away and to restrain himself. However, the man did not seem to understand her gaze. He politely greeted Madame Feng and cleared his throat. As though he was a little thirsty, he turned to look at her. "Why didn't you drink your coffee? Hurry up and read the latest update." Chapter 1176. Seeing that he ignored her warning gaze, Feng Ling said in a muffled voice, "I'm not thirsty. Just nice I'm thirsty." The man directly took the coffee cup in front of her and drank it without standing on ceremony. Feng Ling. She stealthily stepped on his foot under the table and then turned to glare at him. Li Nanheng placed the coffee cup down. As though he did not feel the pressure from her foot, he only looked at Madame Feng, who sat opposite him with a smile in her eyes. He asked, "How are the 2 elders of the Feng family recently?" "They're both very good. However, what happened previously has indeed caused trouble for you, Nanheng. It was Mingzhu's fault. At the time her father and I were not at home. Otherwise we would definitely apologize to the 4 elders of the Li family." Qin Xiu recalled the incident where Feng Mingzhu provoked Li Nanheng. That incident caused several more commotion in the Feng family. It was all because Feng Mingzhu could not accept it. She cried, threw a tantrum and tried to commit suicide at home. The entire family was in a mess and she was truly worried sick. Recently things finally calmed down. Feng Mingzhu was dragged by Madame Tsin's daughter to Italy for a vacation. Only then did the Feng family finally find some peace. They could also take a breather. It's all in the past. Li Nanheng only said these 3 words. Seeing that he did not want to mention it, Madame Feng naturally would not bring it up again. After all, that incident was indeed Feng Mingzhu's fault. Her own daughter was the one who drugged her. Who would be willing to bring it up again? At this moment, Feng Fu's gaze shifted to Feng Ling again. Especially if Feng Ling was really her daughter, then this was not the only thing Feng Mingzhu had done. Feng Ling did not understand what was going on between Madame Feng and Li Nanheng. She only heard that it seemed to have something to do with Feng Mingzhu. However, seeing that they did not continue to bring it up, she did not ask. She only glanced at Li Nanheng and saw that he continued to raise the coffee cup to his lips. "If you want to drink, order another cup." Feng Ling stared at his actions. Although she did not drink it earlier, Madame Feng was watching. "Isn't what's yours mine? If you don't drink it, do you want to wait for it to cool?" The man lightly raised his brows. Feng Ling. At this time Madame Feng suddenly smiled. "The way you young people approach love is indeed different from people of my generation. At my age, looking at the 2 of you, I feel that it's very sweet." At this time Feng Ling turned to look at Madame Feng. She saw that she was really smiling and clearly did not mind Li Nanheng having an ambiguous relationship with a woman other than Feng Mingzhu. Therefore Li Nanheng and Feng Mingzhu really had nothing to do with each other. Then the young lady of the Feng family he married, Feng Ling's mind was suddenly in a mess. As Li Nanheng continued speaking to Madame Feng, she picked up her fork and lowered her head to continue eating the blueberry cake. As she ate, she thought about everything that had happened. After thinking about it for a long time, she still could not figure it out. That's not right. Even if she was really Madame Feng's daughter, everyone should have thought that she was no longer around. How could there be news of her marriage? Who did Li Nanheng marry? Marry a ghost? No matter how she thought about it, she could not figure it out. She stopped thinking about it. Just as she took another bite of cake, one of her hands that was placed under the table was suddenly held by someone. Her movements faltered. She abruptly turned to look at the man who was speaking politely to Madame Feng on the surface but was holding her hand tightly under the table. They were chatting about the matters between the Feng family's 2 elders and the Li family's old man. From the relationship between generations to the various greetings, Feng Ling did not pay much attention. Indeed, she could not pay much attention. Her attention was completely attracted by the unruly hand under the table. At the beginning, the man only held her hand. After a while, he directly locked her hand behind her back and forcefully pressed it against his thigh. He placed her hand on his thigh just like that. She wanted to pull her hand away, but he did not let go. Separated by such a table, the man's face appeared to be a well-dressed and well-mannered junior conversing politely with the madam of a family friend. However, below, he was incomparably beastly as he slowly pulled her hand from his thigh toward his thigh. Although they had yet to touch, Feng Ling did her best to control her hand so that it would not be pulled over. However, just by touching his thigh, she was already about to be burned to ashes. Her mind abruptly recalled that night in Cambodia. That day when she woke up, her hand, could it be, she drank too much at that time and could not remember anything? Could it be that Feng Ling abruptly fixed her gaze on his face? Li Nanheng originally wanted to continue teasing her, but a fierce glint seemed to flash across her eyes. He abruptly let go of her hand. At the moment when she was about to withdraw her hand, he suddenly regretted it and held her hand again. However, this time he did not go too far. He only placed her hand peacefully on his thigh, covered the back of her hand with his hand, and gently held it without letting go. It wasn't that Qin Xiu couldn't see the ambiguous relationship between the two of them. It was obvious that 2 young people were in love, so she didn't feel embarrassed. She just smiled and didn't disturb them too much. After sitting there quietly and taking another sip of coffee, she said, "Nanheng, do you know enough about Feng Ling?" "A lot." As the man spoke firmly, he held Feng Ling's hand tighter, not allowing her to pull her hand away. "Do you think?" Madame Feng looked directly into his eyes and spoke in a slightly serious tone that only he could understand. "Is it suitable for you to be with her?" "Very suitable." Li Nanheng met Madame Feng's probing gaze and smiled lightly. "No one is more suitable than her." What on earth were the 2 of them talking about? Feng Ling tried her best to fight against the hand under the table. She raised her eyes to look at Madame Feng and saw that she suddenly smiled. It was as though an accurate answer had fallen into Madame Feng's heart. Madame Feng smiled and picked up the coffee cup again but did not drink it. She then put it down again and looked at Feng Ling in front of her. It seemed that there were many things she wanted to say, but she felt that this situation was not right. She could only endure it and repeatedly picked it up and put it down. After picking it up and putting it down several times, she suddenly said, "The Feng family and the Li family have been friends for so many years. We can't let the matter between our families turn sour because of Mingzhu. Since we are so fated, why don't you bring Feng Ling to the Feng family one day?" "That depends on her." Li Nanheng tilted his head and pointed at Feng Ling with his chin. "What do I mean?" Feng Ling did not understand their conversation at all. She only remembered that one night, she did not know what this man had done with her hand. She tried to pull it out but he refused to let go. She could not bear it anymore and said in a low voice, "Hurry and let go." "I won't." "Hurry up and read the latest update." Chapter 1177. "I'm not letting go." Li Nanheng did not lower his voice and calmly tightened his grip on her hand. Feng Ling was exasperated. She wished she could throw the uneaten piece of chocolate cake at his face. Madame Feng watched the 2 of them flirting. Although she could not bear to stand up and leave, she still insisted on asking more questions. She wanted to confirm something. However, she could feel that she was an eyesore, so she stood up and said, "Please take a seat. I'm going to the bathroom." Feng Ling hurriedly turned to nod politely at Madame Feng. After Madame Feng turned and walked away, the man by her side lifted her hand. She placed her hand on the table and he continued to hold her hand. When she withdrew her hand, he only moved his fingers slightly to hold her wrist. He did not allow her to move too far away. "Wasn't your attitude quite good earlier?" The man sat very close to her. Even though he did not deliberately move his voice closer when he spoke, it was as though his voice was right by her ear. Of course, Feng Ling wanted to maintain a good attitude and speak to him properly. However, the man's arrogant attitude in front of Madame Feng clearly showed that he did not place anyone else in his eyes. He was really too arrogant. So arrogant that her heart kept beating wildly. The man tugged her hand back and stubbornly placed it on his lap. He seemed to like the way she leaned against his chest and gently placed her hand on his lap. It was almost as though he was relying on her. I thought that after returning from Cambodia, you had already thought of how to treat me well. In the end, Li Nanheng raised his brows slightly and glanced at her hand that was forcefully held on his lap. Is this how you thought of treating our relationship after coming back and being busy for the past few days? Feng Ling faltered and abruptly pulled her hand out from under his palm. She did not speak. Madame Feng naturally could not have really gone to the bathroom. After a while she had yet to return. It was likely that she did not wish to leave early but did not wish to disturb the young people's love life. Thus, after a while there were only the two of them at the table. In this moment of silence, Feng Ling sorted out her emotions and suddenly fell silent. There was a moment of silence. What are you thinking about? Li Nanheng did not touch her again but rubbed the empty coffee cup on the table with one hand. Feng Ling felt that this wasn't a suitable place to say such things. Furthermore, Mrs. Feng might come over at any time. But when the words were on the tip of his tongue, he saw the man sitting patiently by his side. Earlier, even though he clearly knew that the woman was Madame Feng, he had exposed their relationship without any hesitation. He did not even give him the slightest chance to retreat. After waiting for a while and seeing that Madame Feng still hadn't come out, the man's arm on the back of her chair had almost reached her shoulders. She suddenly turned her face and looked him in the eye. Li Nanheng, let's find a time to go on a date. Li Nanheng had just received a glass of lemon water from a passing waiter. He had just taken a sip when he suddenly spat it out. He choked and coughed several times before turning his eyes back to her in disbelief. What did you just say? Go on a date? I thought about it. Since I can't avoid or escape, and I'm destined to be entangled with you like this, I might as well face up to your position in my heart. Feng Ling tried to make her voice sound calmer, and calmer. It's been several years since we started entangling with each other in the base. It's time to put it on the table. Seeing that she wanted to face it calmly, Li Nanheng's lips curved into a faint smile. So, by putting it on the table, do you mean that you're officially going to be my woman? Feng Ling originally wanted to correct him and say that she was his girlfriend. However, the words choked in her throat. She felt that it wasn't far from the truth. It was just a difference of 2 words and 3 words. What was truly important was still this man. Thus, the topic of her words changed slightly and became, let's not talk about anything else first. Tell me the truth about what you did to me in the Cambodian camp that night. Li Nanheng's smile that was about to reach his ears suddenly faltered because of her attempt to get closer to him. Looking at her eyes, it was clear that she had already guessed something. He coughed, raised his hand into a fist and put it to his mouth. He cleared his throat and continued to cough a few more times but did not answer. What exactly did you do to me that night? What else could he do? After being raised by him for so many years, he could only look at her but not eat her. There were several times when he couldn't control his desire and almost pounced on her. In the end, either because she was young or because of various emergencies, he was too busy to do anything to her. It wasn't easy for him to have sex, but because of the Cambodian incident, it was delayed for so long. In the middle he was still as poor as a monk. Later he finally held her in his arms and had a good sleep with her, but she happened to be on her period. Still he could only look at her but not eat her. That night he did go a little crazy. If it weren't for the last bit of rationality he had, he might have done something as shameless as fighting a bloody battle. However, he made her tired for an entire night. Later, he secretly washed her uncomfortable hands with hot water for a long time. After making sure that they were clean, he finally let go of her. That night, he was so ruthless, but he was forced to the extreme by this little vixen and had no choice but to be ruthless. Based on what he did at that time, it was indeed not surprising that her hands would still have some lingering feelings the next day. Why don't we continue to talk about the date? Let's not talk about it. Didn't you just start the topic? Madame Feng came out of the bathroom. When she walked back, Feng Ling turned to look at her. She saw that although she was smiling, her eyes seemed to be a little red. She had cried in the washroom by herself. Why was she crying? She didn't seem to have shown much of her relationship with the Feng family. Even if Madame Feng had some guesses and suspicions, she shouldn't have been so sure. However, it was clear that she had cried. Although she had simply applied some powder under her eyes to hide the traces of her crying, even though the skin around her eyes was covered, her eyes were still red. It seemed like the only thing that could make an elderly woman happy, the only thing that could make her cry, were all related to Feng Ling. Feng Ling's views on family were very weak. Although she wanted to say something to Madame Feng, because she wasn't completely sure of her own identity, she chose to keep her mouth shut. Chapter 1178. Afterward, Feng Ling could not remember what they talked about. She only remembered that Madame Feng repeatedly invited her to visit the Feng family. The reason why Feng Ling's mind was not completely focused on this conversation was because not only was Li Nanheng still holding on to her hand, he had also whispered something obscene to her before Madame Feng returned to sit down. His words were so vulgar and explicit that Feng Ling's head immediately began to fume with anger. "Madame Feng, I'm sorry. If not for Madame Feng's presence, she would definitely have killed him." During this time, she glared fiercely at the man beside her several times, but Li Nanheng only smiled the entire time. Although the words he said earlier were extremely shameless, he could still smile faintly and say some pleasantries to Madame Feng. In the end, even though Madame Feng was reluctant to part with them, she was too embarrassed to continue chatting with the two of them. She repeatedly reminded Feng Ling to find more opportunities to eat and drink with her in the future. After receiving Feng Ling's approval, she finally left the coffee shop with a few steps back. After confirming that Madame Feng had left, Feng Ling instantly erupted in anger. She lowered her voice and cursed in a low voice, "This shameless scoundrel." In response, Li Nanheng turned her head around and lowered his head to kiss her urgently and accurately. The man did not hide his lustful gaze at all. It was as though if this wasn't a coffee shop and if there weren't waiters walking around in public, he would have directly stripped her on the spot. What did he say by her ear earlier? "That night you seduced me yourself. In the end you were still on your period. In order to make me sleep with you, you would rather use your hands to help me. Your hands were so soft and you kept holding on to me, refusing to let go. Your legs were wrapped around me. Tell me, could I have refused?" The man kissed her lips and held her face to prevent her from moving away. Couples often met in this coffee shop. Occasionally, when their feelings reached a certain level, it was common for them to suddenly hug and kiss each other. Although Li Nanheng's kiss was very aggressive, it was not just a light kiss. His kiss contained countless long-hidden desires. The heat and turbulence made Feng Ling wonder if she would be directly taken away by him and swallowed into his stomach. In order not to disturb them, the waiters who were passing by didn't even look in their direction. After being bitten by this bastard for a while, Feng Ling tried to push him away. However, she could not push him away, so she used her fingers to pinch his fingers. The man did not feel any pain. Instead, he held her hand tightly and pressed it against his waist. He then lowered his head and took a deep breath against her ear. His breath landed on the sensitive part of her neck and neck, causing her body to tremble violently. "Li Nanheng." "Yes. Nanheng." Seeing that he was still leaning against her neck without moving, his breath tickling her neck, she raised her voice slightly. "Yes. There are people here, don't?" Before she could finish speaking, the man suddenly pulled her hand down and pressed it against his crotch. Even through his pants, the warmth of her palm could still be felt. At this moment, the man almost couldn't help but moan. Li Nanheng didn't speak much, but the light in his eyes was somewhat crazy. Since that night in Cambodia, when this woman admitted that she liked him and told him everything in her heart, he couldn't describe his desire for her. However, after returning to Los Angeles, because Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan were in the hospital, 11 Base still had many things to deal with the American police, and Feng Ling had been staying in Jin Wan's ward for several days. At this moment, something that had been suppressed for a long time almost burst out at this moment. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was so hard that it hurt. Why was this a coffee shop? When he called earlier, he should have asked her to find a hotel room and wait for him instead of accompanying her to meet Madame Feng. Madame Feng would not hurt her. What was there for him to worry about? What kind of bullshit gentlemanly rule was that? Facing a girl he had loved for so long and who actually had the same feelings for him, he only wanted to do one thing right now. He wanted to press her on the bed and make love to her. He wanted her stubborn eyes that almost never shed tears to redden because of him. He wanted her to lie on the bed crying and begging for mercy. He wanted her to take back the coldness that she always carefully maintained in front of others. He wanted to squeeze out all her rationality. He wanted to hear her call his name in a different tone, the kind that was a little mute, a little begging and a little sobbing, calling his name. He was intoxicated under the glass table in the cafe, pressing her hand down through his pants. No matter how hard she tried to pull her hand away, he wouldn't let her pull her hand away. He continued to press on top of her, rubbing himself against her. The burning sensation on her cheeks made Feng Ling feel as though she was about to burst into flames. There were so many people here. How dare he? Right now the man could not care less about her embarrassment and shyness. His muscles tightened and he pressed hard against her, but he could not extinguish the fire that had been hidden in his body for a long time. The fire burned in his heart. His primitive nature and deeply hidden feelings drove him to kiss her neck. He then held her chin with one hand and kissed her heavily on the lips. "Let's go to the hotel. Baby, I can't wait anymore," he murmured hoarsely against her lips. "If you don't help me resolve this little fire, I can only get hard every time I see you. I can't speak clearly at all. Let's go to the hotel first." Before the last bit of rationality disappeared, Li Nanheng muttered hoarsely as he pulled her up. Feng Ling could not free herself from his hand. Her face was burning hot. She clearly should have warned him not to act recklessly, but under this shyness, even her heart was vaguely looking forward to it. This feeling of her heart being scalded to the point of trembling was very strange. However, as soon as the man pulled her out of the coffee shop, the cell phone in his pocket suddenly rang. Feng Ling felt that the man's grip on her hand was very strong. Obviously, even if the sky collapsed, it could not stop him from wanting to go to the hotel immediately. The hospital and the business district were nearby, and it was still very far from his residence. There was no other choice but to go to the hotel. Feng Ling did not speak. In fact, when she was taken out of the coffee shop by the man, her brain had already stopped working. It was not until the phone in his pocket quieted down and rang again that she reminded him, "Is there something urgent? Answer the phone first." "What urgent thing? Is it more urgent than me?" The man was too lazy to take out his cell phone. "After all, we are in Los Angeles now. You are the boss of 11 Base. What if the military or the police have something urgent to say? Answer the phone first. It won't delay anything." Chapter 1179. Li Nanheng obviously didn't want to answer it. Since he didn't want to answer the call, it meant that he really had something to do. After being pulled across the overpass by the man and was about to return to the hotel next to the department store, his cell phone rang again. This time, Feng Ling suddenly stopped, reached out to take out the cell phone in his coat pocket, and looked down to see that the call was from the base hall. She immediately rolled her eyes at Li Nanheng. "It's from the base hall." The base hall would directly call Li Nanheng's private cell phone. In this case, there must be something urgent. Li Nanheng's attitude in front of her was different from his attitude towards 11 Base. 11 Base was his responsibility. He was rarely so irrational that he didn't even care about the affairs of the base. It could be seen that he was really suffocating. Glancing at her serious expression, Li Nanheng sighed, picked up the phone, and took it with an ugly expression. After listening to a few words, he said indifferently, "I see." With just 3 words, the man hung up the phone. "What's wrong? Was the call from off phone? I think there should be a private number card in this cell phone." "He must be in a hurry to make a private call," Feng Ling said. "After learning what happened in Cambodia, the U.S. military wants to deal with the outlaws who were captured alive and the innocent children who were killed in the explosion. For so many years, they never let go of any opportunity to stir up trouble. What do you think they want to do? They are looking for an opportunity to step on it. Even if they may step on nothing in the end, they still won't easily miss the opportunity. When we were waiting for the U.S. police to send a rescue plane, I didn't see any movement from the military. Seeing that we came back alive, they seized the opportunity when I wasn't in the base to stir up trouble." "That's right. What do you think?" "So, they are all in the base. Ah Feng has temporarily stabilized them. Wait for me to go back and confront them personally." Hearing this, Feng Ling's reason had returned to her own consciousness. The two of them stood on the side of the road and stood like this for a long time. Feng Ling took her hand out of his. "Let's go back first. I'm going back to the hospital. Mrs. Mo is still waiting for me." The man glanced at her. "Is Mrs. Mo more important or am I? Jealous of Jean Wan? Are you serious?" "Very serious." He was resolute. In the end, he didn't forcefully pull her hand down his body, but she could see the hidden fire in the man's eyes. But now was not the time. Besides, there were still soldiers waiting for them in the base. If it was just a trivial matter, Ah Feng would have solved it himself. However, since Ah Feng had called them repeatedly, it meant that the person who came this time was a tough one. If Boss Lee didn't go back in person, it would not be easy to deal with him. Seeing his somewhat dejected expression because the meat that was about to reach his mouth suddenly flew away, he was like a big wolf dog that had almost snatched a piece of meat and suddenly realized that there was not even a shred of meat on the bone. His ears drooped. Feng Ling's heart trembled with shyness, but now she gradually calmed down and found that she was a little relieved. She didn't know what she was thinking, but she didn't want to see a man like Li Nanheng show such a disappointed and unwilling look. She suddenly took the initiative to lean into his arms, kissed him on the chin and said softly, "I'll owe you. I'll wait for you to come back." The man's eyes lit up. He pinched her waist tightly and looked down at her. "Owe you?" There was a satisfied smile in his eyes. He was about to kiss her hard on the lips again, but when he was about to kiss her, he paused. He felt that he had finally sobered up after being splashed with cold water by those bastards in the military. If he kissed her again, let alone the military, even if the Emperor of Heaven wanted to blow up the base, he would definitely take her into the hotel. Li Nanheng raised his hand and rubbed her soft hair. "All right, I'll lend you to Jinwan for a few more days. I think it's time to return you after everything is over. After all, High City isn't a place to stay for long." What he meant was that High City was too far, China was too far, and it was best for her to stay in Los Angeles by his side. Feng Ling knew that he was holding back his pain and did not provoke him or refute him. She only kissed his chin again. "Go." Li Nanheng's eyes darkened from the kiss. At this moment his phone rang again. He immediately turned his head and rolled his eyes at the air. He took out his phone and saw that it was a call from Ah Leng again. With a cold expression, he turned and walked to the parking space by the roadside. Li Nanheng drove Feng Ling back to the hospital. When she got out of the car, the man had more or less calmed down. Earlier she had heard him talking to the base. From his tone and decisiveness, she could tell that the military leaders who were taking the opportunity to cause trouble in the base were most likely going to lose their jobs. After getting out of the car, she turned back to look at the black Hummer that suddenly sped away. She felt that Li Nanheng's car was filled with murderous intent. Mr. Mo's condition had already stabilized, but he still needed to take his medicine and rest regularly. When Feng Ling left the hospital earlier, Mr. Mo was still resting. When she returned, she saw that Jinwan was still in his ward and decided to sit on the chair outside to wait for her. Now that she had calmed down, she carefully recalled the conversation between Madame Feng and Li Nanheng in the coffee shop today. She pondered over it for a long time but could not understand what she had missed. Madame Feng's question to Li Nanheng was clearly serious, and Li Nanheng's reply was also very serious. But this seriousness made her even more puzzled. Did Madame Feng not mind the relationship between her and Li Nanheng at all? Seeing Madame Feng's agitated emotions today, even if she did not really want to investigate her own background, she could vaguely sense that some things were not developing in the direction she could control. For example, the relationship between her and Li Nanheng, and Madame Feng's attitude toward their relationship. As she was thinking, the door to the ward opened and Jinwan walked out. Seeing Feng Ling sitting outside, Jinwan glanced at her. "You weren't in the hospital earlier. What did you go to do?" Feng Ling was thinking about Madame Feng. Hearing Jinwan's question, her gaze faltered. She simply answered, "I dealt with some personal matters. Mr. Li must be suffocating to death, haha. Also, today I suddenly wanted to share some heartfelt words with my family, so it took up a little more than 300 words. Please forgive me. To be honest, even I'm surprised by the results this book has achieved up to this point. Back then, when I wrote Mo Nguyen, I only wanted to write a warm and sweet marriage novel. I didn't expect that I would win the Best Newcomer Award at the 2018 UNIP Awards and even appear on TV because of it. I also didn't expect that I would win the first place in the 2018 Chinese Romance Finals. I'm really gratified. Very happy. I am very grateful for everyone's love for Mo Nguyen, for Ling Li, and for Qing Qing. Wow. Be grateful. As for the monthly votes, I usually only ask for them at the beginning and end of the month. Usually, I'm too embarrassed to ask for monthly votes every day. But thinking about it, it seems that I have received many honors and love. The only monthly vote that I managed to obtain was second place. Although I am already very happy, I also want to complete it once. Even if I can obtain first place for a month, it would be good. Currently, I am only 500 to 600 votes away from first place. There are still 9 days until the end of the month. I also feel too embarrassed to ask for monthly votes so thick-skinned. How about this? If I can get first place in the monthly votes this month, on the 1st of next month, I will post an explosive high-speed race between Feng Ling and Li Nanheng for everyone on Weibo. The kind that transcends desire. Blushing. Chapter 1180. At night, the matter at the base would not be resolved so quickly, so Li Nanheng did not return to the hospital. After buying dinner for Jinwan and Mr. Mo, Feng Ling sat down in the lounge of the hospital alone. There were several unread messages on her cell phone. She opened them and found that they were from people in Boston. Since leaving Boston, she hadn't contacted the people in the martial arts club. It was not that she was too indifferent to others, but that she had always been like this. She never took herself too seriously, didn't think that she was good, and didn't think that others would always miss her. The head coach sent a message to ask her how she was doing recently and why there was no news at all. She didn't reply to the messages sent by the boss, and even if she did reply, she would just say, "I'm fine." And Chen Beiqing, he called her several times but she didn't answer, so he simply sent her a message instead. Chen Beiqing would send her a message almost every 2 or 3 days. He didn't pester her and didn't say much. He just asked her how she was doing recently and said that he would come to Los Angeles to see her when he had time. Seeing these messages, she thought about what Li Nanheng had done to her over the years. Perhaps it was because she had just seen the touching affection between Mr. Mo and Mrs. Mo in Cambodia, or because she had seen the people around her cherish each other after experiencing such a life-and-death disaster. She suddenly recalled the way she had always treated people and things. Perhaps there was no longer a need for her to hide herself in that huge protective shell. It was time to cherish those who treated her well and try to embrace their kindness instead of treating them cautiously, which would only increase the distance between them. Feng Ling picked up the pillow by the bed and held it in her arms. She was about to call the people in Boston and make an appointment to go back to meet them at a certain time in the future. After all, they had worked and lived together for more than a year, and she still had a new apartment that she hadn't lived in. Sooner or later she would have to go there often. She couldn't just abandon these friends she had known. Her fingers were tapping on the screen, looking for their numbers in the address book, when her cell phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. Li Nanheng sent her a message. She held the pillow firmly in her arms and swiped open the message. Li Nanheng had a lot of things to do in the base. He had to go back to the Li family and go to the Los Angeles military base office tomorrow morning. By the time he returned to the hospital, it would be at least tomorrow afternoon. Then he sent another message. After the incident with Li Nanheng, the military did not dare to provoke us again. This time they recklessly used the incident in Cambodia as a topic. It just so happens that everything that needs to be solved has been solved. If there's anyone you don't like, tell me their name and I'll help you deal with them. Feng Ling looked at the 2 messages sent by this man and immediately replied. Feng Ling didn't find anyone unpleasant to the eye. Be careful. Why didn't Li Nanheng say that he owed me during the day? Why is he so distant from me in just a few hours? Feng Ling didn't. I didn't have much contact with the people in the military. It had been so long since the incident with the commander. Even if he was reincarnated, he would probably be a nobody. I didn't care much about those people. After she sent the message, she thought for a moment and sent another message. What time will you be back tomorrow afternoon? Li Nanheng, it's hard to say. Rest early. If you need anything, look for K. I'll drive past the hospital on my way back to the Li family at night. If I see the light in your room is still on, I won't go back to the Li family. I'll go straight to you. Feng Ling, I'll definitely go to bed early. Don't delay your business because of me. Li Nanheng, you're the business. Feng Ling, she paused. Let's talk about it when I come back tomorrow afternoon. You can go and do whatever you need to do. Li Nanheng is fine. He's still dealing with those bastards in the base. I'm sitting here drinking tea and leaving him hanging. I'm fine now. Li Nanheng, you should go to bed early and conserve energy to make up for me. Li Nanheng, you also know that you owe me too much. That time in T-City, I was the one who forced you to sleep with me twice in a row. Now you want to take the initiative? Feng Ling, she changed the topic with a sullen expression. Li Nanheng, my mind is full of going to the hotel today. Do you think I might change the topic? Feng Ling didn't reply. After a moment, Li Nanheng sent, Miss me? Regarding the matter of going to the hotel, she didn't know how to reply and was too embarrassed to reply. However, she held her phone and stared at it for 5 minutes before replying. Feng Ling, N. This could be considered as her admitting her feelings verbally. Even if it was gradual, she couldn't always stand in a passive position, right? She had to learn to cherish it. Li Nanheng, forget it. I won't return to the Li family. You sleep first. At night, I'll go to the hospital to see you. If you're awake, I'll go to your place. If not, I'll go to Mo Jingshan's. Feng Ling, you should be busy with business. I'll definitely sleep. There's no need to come to the hospital. Li Nanheng couldn't bear to. I miss you. I won't be able to sleep well even if I return to the Li family. He was really very straightforward. Feng Ling gradually couldn't help smiling. Elder Li must have something important to talk to you about. Otherwise you wouldn't have agreed to go back. It wouldn't be too late to come tomorrow. Li Nanheng, then sleep early. I'll allow you to miss me. Feng Ling, okay. Li Nanheng remembered what he said today. You still owe me, Feng Ling. I'll sleep. Feng Ling put down her phone. Her heart suddenly felt a little sweet. She instinctively hoped that Li Nanheng would come back immediately. However, he still needed to go to the base in the Li family. It was just one more day. It didn't matter. She threw her phone on the bed, picked up a change of clothes, and went to the public bathroom on this floor of the hospital to take a shower. This floor was full of high-class wards, but it was overcrowded. There were only 2 wards with separate bathrooms. Only the seriously injured Mr. Mo and Mrs. Mo could stay in them. Feng Ling wasn't seriously injured. She just needed to be taken care of here. The resting room she stayed in was already the best among all the resting rooms. However, the bathroom didn't have a separate bathroom, so she had to come out to take a shower. Fortunately, the conditions of this hospital were good. The environment was good and the hygiene was also very good. Right now there was no one in the public bathroom. After taking a shower, she went to Jin Wan's place. After chatting with Jin Wan for a while, she returned to the resting room to sleep. Although she said she was going to sleep after lying down, she still picked up her phone and glanced at it. Li Nanheng didn't send her any more messages. She held the phone and read the conversation between the two of them over and over again. When she realized that she had been reading the conversation for so long and had been reading it over and over again, she immediately turned off the phone screen. In the darkness where the lights had been turned off, she opened her eyes and pressed the phone against her chest. This was the feeling of being in love, right? For M. Chapter 1181. Last night, Mr. Mo's wound was a little inflamed. Jin Wan got up and went out of the ward to take care of him without telling anyone. The next morning, when Feng Ling learned about it, Mr. Mo had already fallen asleep, and Jin Wan had just returned to the ward. Mr. Mo's wound was inflamed, but it was not very serious. He just had a low fever last night. Jin Wan didn't like to be separated from Mr. Mo, so she took this opportunity to stay in his ward all night. Otherwise, she would definitely be driven back to rest by Mr. Mo. Knowing this, Feng Ling didn't ask any more questions. Feng Ling went to buy Jin Wan's favorite breakfast. Seeing that Jin Wan didn't want to sleep after coming back and didn't look very good because of staying up late, she thought of the things she bought yesterday and took them out. Mrs. Mo, do you want to put on a facial mask? Jin Wan was lying on the bed trying to fall asleep, but she couldn't fall asleep. Recently, Su Jilan had been visiting the hospital frequently, which made her worry. However, when Feng Ling approached the bed with the breakfast, her words made Jin Wan open her eyes. She sat up on the bed, saw the things in Feng Ling's hand, took them and put all kinds of facial masks on her bed. Why did you buy these things? Jin Wan was surprised and couldn't imagine Feng Ling standing in front of the skincare counter. I've been in the hospital recently. Mr. Mo was seriously injured. You said you were fine but you couldn't sleep every day. You don't look very good. I heard that women should often use facial masks when their skin condition is bad. I have never used this kind of thing and I don't know which brand is better. When I went out to buy things I bought a few in the mall. Hearing her words, Jin Wan picked up 2 of them and the corner of her mouth twitched. Sure enough, Feng Ling had never used skincare products, nor had she used facial masks. In addition to whitening and hydrating, there were even skin lifting, tightening and wrinkle removing products. Both of them were in their early 20s and their faces were full of collagen. How could they use these things? You haven't used them? Jin Wan suddenly smiled and looked up at her. As soon as Feng Ling saw Jin Wan's bright eyes, she immediately understood what she meant and quickly took a step back. Mrs. Mo, these are all for you. Even so, I don't need so much. Jin Wan picked up 2 of the simplest moisturizing masks and waved at her. Come here. Don't hide so far away. Anyway, we have nothing to do now. We might as well keep making facial masks instead of waiting in the hospital. Anyway, you've bought them. Seeing Feng Ling's determined expression, Jin Wan narrowed her eyes and smiled. You really don't want to try it? You've been in the base for so many years. Although your skin is good, it's still a little dry compared to those young ladies raised at home. Since you've bought so many, why don't you try it with me? Feng Ling, forget it. I've never used such a thing before. Besides, why do I need such good skin? Jin Wan smiled. You really don't think of yourself as a woman anymore? Feng Ling hesitated because of his words. She was not feminine at all. What on earth was Li Nanheng infatuated with her? Since she didn't want to be passive anymore, shouldn't she try to accept some changes? She had to be worthy of his love for her. Am I really not like a woman? Do you feel like a woman when you look in the mirror? I rarely look in the mirror. Jin Wan. In the end, Feng Ling still failed to persuade Jin Wan. Jinwan dragged her into the small bathroom in the ward and asked her to wash her face. She also took a black rubber band and tied the short bangs in front of Feng Ling's forehead into a high bun, exposing her face and forehead, and then taught her how to use this kind of bubble cleanser. The two women washed their faces in front of the mirror in the bathroom, rubbed bubbles on their faces and then put a mask on their faces. At first, Feng Ling didn't even know how to apply it. Jinwan taught her little by little, but unexpectedly, this woman who could shoot the whole world with a gun was defeated by a piece of facial mask paper. Finally, after Feng Ling tore up 3 facial masks, Jinwan successfully put a complete facial mask on her face. None of the patients passing by outside the ward could imagine what the two people were doing in the midst of their busy schedule. A few minutes later, Kay came to knock on the door and Jinwan answered. Feng Ling just came out of the bathroom and didn't realize that someone was coming in, so when the door was pushed from the outside to the inside, Feng Ling suddenly stopped. Kay came to find Feng Ling, but he didn't expect to see the two of them as soon as he entered the door. There were a few holes in the white facial mask, and the two women stared at him with almost the same big eyes. Jinwan was okay. After all, she was Mrs. Mo, the most famous lady in High City. Everyone loved beauty, let alone Mrs. Mo. But Feng Ling was applying a facial mask, which was more shocking. Looking at the thing on Feng Ling's face, Kay was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. He was even more surprised than when he learned that Feng Ling was a woman. As soon as Feng Ling saw his expression, she raised her hand and was about to take off the thing on her face. Kay, however, quickly raised his phone and took a photo of her. As soon as Feng Ling raised her hand, she froze. "Why did you take a photo of me?" "Damn it, I've seen Feng Ling applying a facial mask before I was born. I must show this photo to boss." With that, Kay forgot why he came just now. Before Feng Ling went up to grab him, he opened the door and slipped out as if his soles were smeared with oil. "Kay, delete the photo." Feng Ling's expression froze and she chased after him. Jinwan looked speechlessly at the two people who flashed out like the wind. Not to mention that Kay was almost as good as Feng Ling, it was still unknown whether Feng Ling could catch up with him. After all, Kay was a man with long and flexible legs, but Feng Ling just went out with a facial mask on her face. Was she going to let the whole hospital see? Feng Ling chased him fast and Kay ran away fast. He seemed to be afraid that she would catch up with him and smash his cell phone again. In order to protect himself, Kay ran directly to Mo Jingshan's ward area. When he came to the door of the ward, he saw Boss Li coming out at this time, so he immediately stopped and hid behind him. Then he looked at Feng Ling, who had chased up to him, and smiled smugly, as if he was not afraid of death under the protection of Boss. Feng Ling thought that Li Nanheng would come back in the afternoon, but she didn't expect that he would return to the hospital so early. She suddenly stopped. For M. Chapter 1182. Boss, don't sell me out. Kay hid behind Li Nanheng and whispered. Li Nanheng, who had just come out, didn't know what was going on, but he saw Feng Ling with a mask on her face. He didn't go back to the Li family last night. After learning that Mo Jingshan's wound was inflamed, he took the time to pass by and was about to drive back to the Li family. He didn't expect to see such a scene. "What the hell are you doing?" Li Nanheng gave her a strange look. If it weren't for the fact that he was too familiar with Feng Ling, he wouldn't have thought that this woman who ran out with a white thing on her was some kind of monster. Feng Ling. Li Nanheng reached out and peeled off the mask paper on Feng Ling's face. Seeing that her face was wet, he raised his eyebrows and touched her chin with his fingers, only to touch a wet and sticky essence. He didn't go to her room last night. Now that he had bumped into her, he wanted to say goodbye to his little wife before leaving. However, as a straight man, he had never used these things in his hands before. He shook his hand in disgust. "What the hell is this? It's wet and sticky." Jinwan came over after washing her face and heard Li Nanheng's complaints from a distance. Feng Ling felt a little embarrassed and was about to raise her sleeve to wipe her face, when Jinwan hurriedly came forward and handed her the towel that had been washed with warm water, and then glanced at Kay and Li Nanheng. "Sure enough, you can't blame my Feng Ling for not being feminine. She stays with you guys every day. It's strange that she can be feminine." Feng Ling's heart sank. She wanted to try to find some feminine feelings and try to change, but this first step was a big blow to her. She wiped her face with the towel, and the skin on her cheeks was a little red because she wiped too hard. Li Nanheng didn't sleep all night. In the first half of the night, he stayed in the base with the military people thinking about Feng Ling. In the second half of the night, he went out to deal with things. Although he was not very sleepy, he was certainly not as energetic as usual. He glanced at Jin Wan and then at Feng Ling. Seeing that Feng Ling's face was slightly red from her own rubbing, she realized that her expression of disdain for the essence seemed to have hurt her. Li Nanheng was speechless. He really didn't dislike it. It was just that he, as a man, had never touched the essence on the mask. His first instinct was to feel awkward, so he just said it casually. He didn't know if she slept well last night, but he missed her so much that he couldn't fall asleep. You stayed in the ward all night last night and didn't rest today. You're really energetic, Li Nanheng said coldly to Jin Wan. Jin Wan and Li Nanheng often quarreled with each other, so she was used to it. However, she could see that Feng Ling was obviously in a bad mood, so she didn't say much but just gave Li Nanheng a good luck expression. You were talking to him in his ward just now. Did he fall asleep again? I'm not asleep. I just received a call from the company. Are you going to stay in his ward? Do you need me to ask the doctor to move your bed to this room so that you can stay here with him? Then you won't have to squeeze into the same bed. Li Nanheng teased her. Are you going to stay in his ward? Jin Wan knew he was teasing her, but she didn't refuse and smiled. It seems to be a good idea. Li Nanheng sneered. In your dreams. Mrs. Mo, I'm going to wash my face, Feng Ling said lightly at this time and turned to leave. Jin Wan turned back and was about to follow him, but before she took a step, Li Nanheng had already walked up to her with a strong desire to survive. Feng Ling, the man's voice was just behind her. Feng Ling didn't want to speak, so she didn't speak and went straight to her room. Stop. Don't stand. She silently replied with 2 words in her heart, rolled her eyes at the air and continued to walk. The man was tall and had long legs, but Jin Wan and the others were still behind him, so he didn't rush. When he walked around the corner in front of the corridor, he quickly stepped forward, grabbed her arm and pulled her back into his arms. Because Feng Ling walked too fast, she suddenly bumped into his arms and was about to struggle out of his arms. At this moment, the man raised his hand and caressed her face that hadn't been wiped clean. He held her face. I didn't mean what I said just now. Don't be angry. Feng Ling couldn't say she was angry. She just looked at him in a muffled voice and was about to turn her face away, but the man still held her face and refused to let go. At this moment, he didn't mind the essence that hadn't been wiped clean on both sides of her cheeks. You've never used this kind of thing before and you suddenly used it. It's definitely related to Jin Wan. It's fine if you're willing, but if you're forcing yourself to become prettier and more beautiful, then let me tell you right now, you don't need to. Everything about you is already perfect in my eyes, and you don't need to deliberately make any changes. Li Nanheng knew Feng Ling too well. Someone like her would suddenly put on a mask and stick this cold and wet thing on her face. According to her behavior these days, he could see that she was just trying to change for him. Although he was very pleased with this reason, he didn't want her to force herself. Feng Ling didn't move and just raised her hand to touch the remaining essence on her cheeks. I didn't force myself. Li Nanheng then looked at the fringe on her forehead that was tied into a small bow on the top of her head. She was really invincibly cute. He smiled and raised his hand to touch her head again. You are very good now. When you were in your teens you were still flat-chested. I liked you very much, let alone now. The man glanced at the part below her collar meaningfully. It's very perfect. There's no need to change. This man's words were quite pleasing to her, but he said that she used to be a small flat chest. Feng Ling stared at him for a long time and finally couldn't help replying, I wasn't flat before. I was wrapped in a chest cloth. Yes, it wasn't flat. After all, I touched it more than once when you were dressed in women's clothes. It really didn't feel flat. The man smiled. Feng Ling, her face was a little red. She didn't know how red it was because of the rubbing and the heat on her face. She turned around and said, let go of me first. I'll go back to wash my face. I have to go back to the Li family later. Why are you in a hurry to wash your face? Didn't you just wipe it? The man said as he pressed her against the wall by the elevator door, held her waist, and with the eagerness of yesterday, he lowered his head and was about to kiss her. The monthly votes were rising happily. I don't need to say anything. I just love you, I just love you, I just love you. For M. Chapter 1183. But this was a hospital where people came and went. Even though the corner was out of Jin Wan's and Kay's sight, there were still doctors and nurses walking back and forth nearby. Feng Ling raised her hand and covered the man's mouth that was about to kiss her. She hinted at him with her eyes to restrain himself. However, the man just held her like this, tilted his head and looked down at her with a smile. He did not force himself to kiss her but gently kissed her palm. Under the man's seductive and meaningful gaze, Feng Ling felt that the part of her palm that was touched by his lips was frighteningly hot. She hurriedly put her hands down and stood by the wall. At the same time, she glanced sideways at the corner, only to find that Mr. Mo's father had come out of another elevator with Secretary In, and Jin Wan had bumped into them. Mr. Mo hadn't recovered from his injury yet, but Shu Yen was brought here so blatantly by Director Mo. It seemed that Director Mo didn't care about Jin Wan's feelings at all. Director Mo is here. I'll go back to wash my face and help Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling gave Li Nanheng a look, meaning for him to stop teasing Jin Wan and try to help her as much as possible, so as not to be taken advantage of by Director Mo. Me? Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and also glanced in that direction. Do you think she is as calm and docile as she looks? Jin Wan is even more stubborn than me. Why would she need my help? I don't care. If you're my man, you have to help my friend. Jin Wan said that I'm her friend. Li Nanheng's eyes instantly brightened. He lowered his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who had just blurted out those words. Man. All right, I'll help. The man immediately smiled happily. Feng Ling. She fled. Seeing that Feng Ling was really in a hurry to go back to wash her face, Li Nanheng did not stop her. He casually picked up a cigarette and put it in his mouth. Recalling the expression on Feng Ling's face when she said he was her man, he immediately smiled, looked back at Jin Wan, and walked over with the unlit cigarette in his mouth without lighting it. Since his wife asked him to help, he would help. Outside Mo Jingshan's ward, Shu Yen was carrying some nutrition products and a fruit basket. She had just walked over when she was stopped by Li Nanheng. He glanced at her coldly. Missin, are you here to visit on behalf of Director Mo? Seeing that it was Li Nanheng, Shu Yen retracted her arrogant expression and nodded politely. Yes, Director Mo asked me to visit Jingshan. Li Nanheng put on a fake smile, but his smile was obviously cold. His tall and straight figure still blocked the door of the ward, and he said coldly, he is resting. It's really inconvenient for Missin to go in like this. If you need any condolences or instructions, just tell Mrs. Mo. She will help you convey them. Standing on the elevator side, Jin Wan heard his words and silently gave Li Nanheng a thumbs up in her heart. She didn't expect that Nanheng, who usually disliked her and always wanted to argue with her, would be so reliable when it was time to help her. Mr. Li, Director Mo is there. He should have heard what I said just now, Shu Yen emphasized. Li Nanheng took the cigarette out of his mouth and said coldly, I've been friends with Mo Jingshan for many years, but I have nothing to do with Shine Group. Chairman Mo, you should know my temper. I'm afraid that unrelated people won't be able to break into my place. As he said this, Li Nanheng glanced coldly at Director Mo with a faint smile. Hearing this, Mo Xiaoza was obviously a little unhappy, but he had to admit that this hospital was surrounded by people from 11 base. If he hadn't been able to get in because he was Mo Jingshan's father, it would have been difficult for him to get to this floor. My own son is hospitalized here. As a father, I just want to see him. Why should I be stopped by you? Mo Xiaoza asked coldly, his eyes unkind and unhappy. If Director Mo wants to go in, of course I won't stop you. Li Nanheng's tone was unhurried and cold. But I'm afraid it's not appropriate for Missin to go in. Mrs. Mo is still watching here. If you let Missin in, are you sure you're not joking, Director Mo? Mo Xiaoza frowned coldly, but Shu Yen was a little embarrassed by Li Nanheng's words. In the end, she couldn't put down her pride and walked to Jin Wan's side, handing her something in her hand. Mrs. Mo, sorry to trouble you. Seeing that Jin Wan could deal with the situation alone without offending the elders, Li Nanheng didn't say anything more and left. He had to go back to the Li family because he hadn't finished dealing with the outside affairs, but before he went back, he could take a look at his little wife who had just admitted that he was her man. Feng Ling had just washed her face in the break room and was wiping away the water stains on her face. She didn't really use any skincare products, but the cream she bought for Jin Wan yesterday smelled very good. It was a very, very light fragrance. Jin Wan said that no matter how expensive it was in the end, it only had the most practical moisturizing effect. Feng Ling glanced at it, picked it up, dipped a little with her finger, applied it to her face and then patted it off bit by bit. She had to thank Ling Feifei back in T-City for learning how to apply skincare products. If it weren't for the fact that Ling Feifei would stand in the dormitory for a long time to apply skincare products after washing her face every morning and night, she wouldn't have been taught to the point where she could even use skincare products. After applying a thin layer, she felt that her usually fair but slightly dry skin looked moist and smooth to the touch. No wonder women like to use skincare products. She patted her face and considered whether to buy a few bottles for herself. She was definitely embarrassed to use Jean Wan's, even if Jean Wan was willing to let her use it. As she was thinking, the door of the break room suddenly opened. Knowing that she lived alone, Li Nanheng didn't knock on the door when he entered, but as soon as he came in, he saw that Feng Ling was still standing in front of a small mirror on the wall of the break room, poking her own face with her own finger. Feng Ling, the best sniper of 11 base who had always been handsome, was hiding in the room acting cute. With just a glance, Li Nanheng's heart almost melted. He walked over, grabbed Feng Ling's wrist, and decisively pulled her into his arms. He lowered his head and continued what he hadn't finished outside just now. He kissed her hard on the lips. Dissatisfied with the kiss, he swept his tongue across her lips, forced her lips open and kissed her deeper. Chapter 1184. Feng Ling paused because of his sudden estrus. Thinking of how hard he had been suppressing his desire yesterday, she guessed that it would not be so easy to extinguish today. Besides, there was no one else here, so she did not struggle. She allowed the man to hug and kiss her for a long time. During this time, Feng Ling carefully tried to respond. She wasn't good at responding, but she felt that it wasn't good for her to be moved like this. She moved her lips and mimicked his movements to kiss and suck his tongue. The man seemed to have been stimulated. He held her tightly in his arms and bit her lips deeply and heavily for a long time. If it weren't for the fact that he had something important to do, Feng Ling felt that this man would directly touch her again. From this kiss full of hot desire, she could feel how hard it was for him to hold back. In the end, he forcibly restrained himself, but at the same time he held her waist, bent down to kiss her ear, and said while kissing her earlobe, "Don't just care about taking care of Jean Wan and Mo Jingshan all day. The employer-bodyguard relationship between you and Jean Wan is basically about to expire. In a few days you will still be mine. You will also be Jean Wan's friend. Pay attention to your rest and don't work too hard." Was it about to expire? Feng Ling had always thought that after this matter was over, she would continue to accompany Jean Wan back to High City. She didn't know what this so-called expiration was. When she first went there, it was Dr. Qin who introduced her. Later, it seemed that Xiao Su took her to the Yu Garden to see Jean Wan and to meet Mr. Mo. However, at that time she didn't pay much attention to the contract. She only knew that it was not a lifelong contract. At that time, Xiao Su did say that she should live in the sea for a few months as a way to relax. A few months. It actually expired just like that. But it didn't matter. Right now, her relationship with Jean Wan was very good. Even if she was not an employer and bodyguard in the future, they would still be friends. In many ways in her heart, she was definitely still on Jean Wan's side because Jean Wan was good to her. After the contract with the bodyguard in High City expires, what do you think? The man's words suddenly fell on her ears. Feng Ling, I haven't thought about this problem. Stay by my side? If it was in the past, she would definitely run as far as she could. But now, she had already decided to follow her heart. In this relationship, she didn't want to be passive all the time. She couldn't always enjoy Li Nanheng's kindness to her. When it was time to express her feelings, she couldn't hide them anymore. Since they had feelings, she should be more honest. She pondered for a moment before saying, I don't have any plans for now, so I'll stay here for now. We'll talk about it when the contract expires. Even if I only have 1 day left, I'm still her bodyguard. Sure. Knowing her stubbornness, Li Nanheng didn't ask any more questions. He smiled and raised his hand to touch the little knot on her head. Now that she could gradually stop retreating and take the initiative to take a step forward, even if it was just half a step, it was enough for him. Feng Ling couldn't help but raise her hand to untie the little thing on her head. However, the man fondled it fondly for a long time and slapped away her hand that was about to lift up to untie it. After fondling it for a long time and playing with it for a long time, his phone rang. The man raised his eyebrows, picked up his phone, looked at the caller ID and turned to walk out. All right, I'll go back to the Li family first. Feng Ling responded simply. After the man left, she turned to look at the small mirror on the wall for a while and raised her hand to touch the bangs on her head. Thinking of Li Nanheng's fondness for it just now, she strangely felt that her face was getting hotter and hotter. She felt a little uncomfortable standing there and quickly untied the little knot on her head. Then she looked at the little black rubber band in her hand, but she couldn't bear to throw it away. She turned back and put it on the drawer by the bed. In the past few days when Feng Ling was in the hospital, Li Nanheng really didn't have time to idle. As time went by, the two of them didn't have a chance to talk to each other for about a week. Every time they met in the hospital, they only glanced at each other. In the end, Li Nanheng couldn't bear it anymore. While he was busy in the base, he told Ah Feng a few words. Ah Feng received the order and didn't dare to disobey. So Feng Ling had just accompanied Jin Wan in the hospital and applied medicine for the burn on her hand. As soon as she returned to the lounge, she received a courier. She had never received a courier before. When she took the courier back, she opened it and saw that it was an application document that 11 Base had specially arranged for her. This time, in addition to the application document, there was also a position arrangement in the base. 11 Base hadn't recruited new people for almost 3 years. The old people who passed the assessment were arranged to work in the military, the police, and the security department of the United Nations in batches, and the old people left in the base also had their own duties in the base. Drill masters like Han Jin, who was qualified to teach old people, didn't directly teach new people. Now his position in the base was similar to that of Ah Feng, and he was in charge of the base hall. Now the base lacked drill masters, especially drill masters who trained new people. The base now recruited 2 teams of newcomers, each team of 20 people. One of the teams was led by a former member of Team 2 who had a good performance in the assessment, and the other team they planned to let Feng Ling go back to lead. What he meant was to give Feng Ling a chance to remember her original intentions while applying for the job. When she was in the base, she also came out from Team 1, Team 2 and Team 3 in the same way. In the past, she refused to accept the so-called shooting instructor training method, but if it was to teach newcomers, the possibility of her accepting it was slightly higher. Sure enough, looking at the documents, Feng Ling hesitated and didn't directly refuse. If she went back, she would tacitly agree to return to the base. And she knew most of the situation in the base, and the information written in the documents was true. Now it was really difficult to find a suitable drill master. She could find any one of the previous drill masters, but she wanted to make good achievements in all aspects, not lose the face of the base in front of the new people, and really lay a good foundation for the new people. Feng Ling was quite confident in this point. Since the contract between her and Mrs. Mo was coming to an end, she didn't know where to go for the time being, and since she had chosen Li Nanheng, Feng Ling looked at the documents in her hand for a while, picked up her cell phone and called the base hall. The call was answered by Ah Feng. She didn't say too much and said directly, "I agree to be the drill master, but I'd better keep a low profile when I return to the base. Don't let those people in Team 3 complain about me. After all, I've been away for so long, and I don't want to cause any trouble." Chapter 1185. Ah Feng didn't expect that Feng Ling would agree so quickly this time and easily completed the task assigned by boss. He was secretly delighted. Okay, let's keep a low profile. As long as you come back, everything will be fine." Ah Feng was usually a very serious person, especially when he was assigned to the base by the elders of the Li family to be responsible for managing various things, which was equivalent to the eyes of the elders of the Li family. However, he was quite loyal. She remembered that when she was driven out of the base, Ah Feng saw it from the side. He obviously couldn't bear to see her like this, but after all, he had his duty and rules, so he didn't say anything to her face. Feng Ling was more or less infected by such an honest and serious person's happy tone, and she also felt as if she had inadvertently let go of the past things. It was also good to go back like this. The identity of a newcomer drill master was not as noble as that of an official shooting drill master in the base. Those who still criticized her in the base would be more accepted, so that she could avoid a lot of gossip and trouble. On the day Jin Wan and Mr. Mo were discharged from the hospital, they went to 11 base first. Mr. Mo had something to discuss at the base. It was rare for him to come to the base in person, so many people went to the conference room. Feng Ling accompanied Jin Wan to walk around the base. Kay would occasionally come over to explain the various places and facilities of the base to Jin Wan. After visiting the shooting training ground and some training areas for close combat, Jin Wan looked at the members who still insisted on training for several hours in such cold weather and turned to look at Feng Ling. "Did you do this every day?" Feng Ling glanced over and nodded. "Mrs. Mo, don't be fooled by Feng Ling's small body. Every time we train, she's better than us. When we fight, she's always the first one. Let's not talk about sniper rifles. In terms of close combat, 80% of the people in our base can't beat her." Kay said and put his arm around Feng Ling's shoulder as if they were brothers. Feng Ling didn't avoid him but said coldly, "I refuse to be flattered." Kay smiled. "What? Are you afraid that Mrs. Mo will know your position in our base? You want to raise her salary?" Alas, it's not that Mrs. Mo can't afford it. The news that Feng Ling was going back to the base had been spread among these people. Everyone was happy and waited for her to come back. Get lost. Feng Ling raised her hand and slapped him away. I'll accompany her for a while. Why is a man following her? I don't think I can have a private conversation with Mrs. Mo. Last time when she put on a facial mask, it was so embarrassing that I almost smashed my phone. Before Kay finished his words, Feng Ling raised her foot to kick him. He nimbly dodged and ran away. Afterward, Jinwan watched the figures who were training. Perhaps even women had some heroism in their bones. Even if they did not receive training from a young age, they still wanted to learn as much as they could. Thus, Jinwan asked Feng Ling to teach her how to shoot. Feng Ling happened to be free. If Jinwan could learn some simple self-defense skills or teach her how to shoot safely without accidentally firing, she would certainly be happy to teach her. After all, last time in Cambodia, although Jinwan had fired a gun, she didn't know how to use it and almost hurt herself. It was a good time to teach him now. In fact, if Feng Ling hadn't promised the base that she would come back, when Jinwan said she wanted to stay by her side to teach her some martial arts, Feng Ling would have been a little shaken and didn't want to be separated from Jinwan. But everyone had their own path to walk. Sooner or later, Jinwan would return to High City with Mr. Mo, and she didn't belong to High City. Behind her was 11 Base, and the man she loved was Li Nanheng. She couldn't cut him off, nor could she give him up. The next day, Mr. Mo and Jinwan returned to the Mo family in Los Angeles. Feng Ling didn't need to follow them, so she had nothing to do. Feng didn't think so. Seeing Mr. and Mrs. Mo leave, he hurriedly came to Feng Ling with the list of the new members of the base, fearing that she would regret it and run away again. This is the list of the new members of the team arranged for you. These members are older than when you first joined the team, but they are only 18 or 19 years old. Now the base is not allowed to recruit children under the age of 16. Even if they want to join, they have to wait until they are old enough. The opportunity to sneak in at the age of 13 has completely disappeared. Hearing this, Feng Ling picked up the list and glanced at it. They were indeed all 18 or 19 years old. In fact, they were not much younger than her. She was only 21 years old now. Mrs. Feng meant that she was now 21 years old. But she was only half a year older than her previous age and birthday, so there wasn't much difference between them. But the newcomers at this age are easier to train. Although they are also troublesome, at least they can understand and abide by the rules, unlike the young ones. Occasionally we have to take care of their emotions. At this age we don't need to take care of them. If they make a mistake we can punish them directly. If they can't hold on we can kick them out. In the base, psychological strength is more important. Okay. Feng Ling responded mildly. As she looked at the list she asked, "Who's the one who suddenly arranged such a job for me?" She didn't expect that she would suddenly ask this question. Feng directly said what he had prepared before. Of course it's the base hall's idea. Now the leadership is so short of manpower. These elite members were accidentally lost outside. Now that we finally have a chance to bring them back, we must try our best to bring them back. Really? He couldn't wait for her to stay in the base every day and stay by his side. She didn't say anything but smiled lightly. All right, I'll take these people. But I just came back and haven't trained for a long time. I have to review many basic movements and postures. Give me 3 days to recover. I'll go see these people. Li Nanheng nodded. Okay, I'll take them back. But I just came back and haven't trained for a long time. I have to review many basic movements and postures. Okay, 3 days is fine. After Feng left, Feng Ling stood in the conference room of the base, turned around and walked out of the door. She looked at the large training grounds and the assembly square in the middle of the base. She could vaguely hear the uniform footsteps of a team of players training. She breathed in the familiar air here and smiled. Dashba, I'm back. It means that the little lamb has returned to the wolf's cave. Ha! I beg for monthly votes. Chapter 1186. Although Feng Ling was back, she was no longer a member of the sniper team. This time she came back with a new identity and responsibilities, so she couldn't live there temporarily. Li Nanheng was the only one living in the entire building. In the room next to his, Li Nanheng was the only one living in the room. In the room next to his, Feng Ling came back as a woman, so she couldn't live next to Li Nanheng so openly. Even though most people in the base had a tacit understanding about many things, in order not to affect the atmosphere of the base, Feng Ling still had to move out. 2 days later, there was still 1 day before Feng Ling officially took over the newcomers. Li Nanheng happened to be busy with those tricky things today and returned to the base, but he still had business to talk about in the base hall. On the way back, he learned that Feng Ling had settled down in the base these days and didn't intend to leave again. He was very relieved about Feng Ling's current state. Although he missed her very much, he still went to the hall to talk about the military affairs first. As soon as Li Nanheng's car stopped in front of the hall, he got out of the car and was about to walk in when he suddenly heard something. He turned back and saw that Feng Ling had come from some direction. She was carrying 2 large suitcases in her hands and was huffing and puffing as she dragged the suitcases to the door of the hall. Seeing Feng Ling's suitcases, he knew they were definitely not light. Li Nanheng walked down and took the suitcases for her. "What's this?" Feng Ling didn't expect him to suddenly come back. She suddenly raised her eyes to see the man and was stunned. Then she saw the man's effortless expression as he helped her carry the suitcases, and she secretly thought, sure enough, men and women are still somewhat different. No matter how agile she was, in terms of strength, if the full score was 100, Li Nanheng could give her 150 points. As for herself, no matter how long she trained, she could at most give her 70 or 80 points in her best state. The biggest difference between men and women was the disparity in strength. Ah Feng said he arranged for me to live in the base hall for the time being. There is a room on the corner of the 2nd floor of the base hall. He asked me to live in it, Feng Ling said as she reached out to help him. As soon as Li Nanheng heard this, he didn't lift the suitcase anymore. He put the suitcase back on the ground and said angrily, "You live in the base hall?" "Yes, what else?" Feng Ling glanced at the suitcase that he had thrown away, and then looked up at him. "Since I am the drill master of the newbies, I must live in the place closest to the newbies, but because of my gender, it is not convenient for me to live in the same building as them. The base hall is the closest place to the training ground for the newbies, and the brothers in the sniper team have already moved to their new residence. If I don't live here, where else can I live?" Li Nanheng glanced at her coldly. "You can't stay there?" Feng Ling, Ah Feng heard the sound of the car just now and knew that Boss Li was back, but he didn't see him for a while, so he subconsciously came out to see the situation, only to hear Li Nanheng's cold words. Ah Feng cleared his throat, pretended to cough and said, "Boss, although this base is yours, 95% of the brothers in our base are single, and the remaining 5% who have girlfriends can't see each other for months. You'd better restrain yourself in the base. Isn't it too much to let Feng Ling live in your place?" Li Nanheng glanced at him coldly. "I'm talking about my neighbor. What are you thinking? You can't live next door either. There is only a wall between us and now you live alone in that building. There is no one else." Ah Feng said with a smile. In the past, everyone thought Feng Ling was a man. Now everyone basically knows what happened between you and her. What's the difference between you and her? What's the difference between living in the same building and sleeping in the same bed? Feng Ling, you are the boss. Even if you have the final say here, you still have to take everyone's feelings into consideration. In private, in a place where no one can see or feel, you and Feng Ling can do whatever you want, but I still say don't go too far on the surface. With that, Ah Feng looked at Feng Ling and winked at her, meaning for her to understand. Now we can only live here for the time being. Don't be picky. Feng Ling, we don't have to mess around. It's good to live in the base hall. This is the best place in the base in terms of view and environment. How can I be picky? Li Nanheng's face darkened. Of course the base hall was good. Of course the view and environment were good. It was so good that whenever he wanted to come to find Feng Ling at night and do something that wouldn't irritate the singles in the base, he had to walk under the surveillance cameras at the main entrance of the base hall. There were many surveillance cameras around here, including all the corridors inside, and there were many people coming and going here. It was the highest position in the middle of the base. Why did he try so hard to coax Feng Ling back to the base? Just to see her but not to eat her? What the hell was he trying to do? As the boss of the base, Li Nanheng was the boss of everyone here and their boss. Every time they went out on a mission, he would pay for the large amount of mission subsidies and bonuses. Even if he was so generous that no one could gossip about him, after all, the base was full of single dogs, and Feng Ling was indeed the only woman who was allowed to stay. This rule of the base had just been broken. If he did other things too openly, it would make things difficult for her. It's fine if you don't live in my place. Just move to another place. Li Nanheng's face was dark. Isn't there a newly built single-family building next to the training building for the newcomers? Ah Feng curled his lips. That building has only been built for a few months, and the facilities in it haven't been set up yet. The water and electricity haven't been set up yet, including various bedding facilities and daily necessities. I was busy with other things in the past few months, so I didn't pay attention to these newly built single-family buildings in the base. Even if you want Feng Ling to move in, you have to at least get these things done. Putting aside the time it will take for her to live in it, it will be at least 3 months later. She still has to live here for the next 3 months. Hearing this, Feng Ling didn't want to waste any more time, so she said, "It's okay. I'll live here. It's really good. W. for M." Chapter 1187. Damn it. Li Nanheng cursed in his heart but said coldly and expressionlessly, "Are you sure you want to live here?" "Yes." Feng Ling nodded. The next moment he suddenly received a cold look from Li Nanheng. Ah Feng stood straight in front of the base hall and said very professionally, "Although you are the boss, I still have the final say in the various backup matters in the base. Boss, no matter how unhappy you are, you have to hold it in." Speaking of this, in order to live a better life in the base in the future and not be troubled by Boss Li every day, Ah Feng hurriedly added, "Even if you really can't help but want to do something with Feng Ling, you're the boss after all. You can leave the base at any time. After taking her out of the base, you can do whatever you want to her. Just be careful. Don't let Feng Ling come back the next day to train the new members." Ah Feng nodded. Feng Ling, she couldn't bear it anymore. She endured it and went forward to pick up the suitcase. "I'll move in first. I just packed a lot of things in the original residence that I didn't take away before. There are a lot of things in these 2 suitcases. I have to clean them up for a while." No wonder there seemed to be so many things. There were more things than when she left the base. Li Nanheng cursed in his heart and his face was full of displeasure, but now Feng Ling was willing to stay here, which was already the biggest concession she had made recently. In order to avoid being entangled in public opinion in the base, he had to be careful. Feng Ling was about to lift the suitcase, but in the next moment, her hands suddenly became light. Li Nanheng, who was full of the words, "I am very unhappy now," walked up the stairs in front of the base hall with her suitcase, and when passing by Ah Feng he said coldly, "Which room?" "Lead the way." Ah Feng knew that now was not the time to provoke Boss. While Boss Li was still rational, at least in front of Feng Ling, he hurriedly stepped forward to lead the way. Feng Ling walked behind, saw the 2 men, one in front and one behind, and then saw Li Nanheng's back as he helped her carry the suitcase in. She watched as he carried the heavy object without affecting his steady pace. Even though he was wearing a uniform under the black sleeves, she could still vaguely see the muscle lines on the man's arms. And was this the so-called boyfriend power? At this moment she only felt that her heart was full of. He went upstairs and walked to his room on the 2nd floor of the base hall. After entering the room, Feng Ling found that it was a completely different world. It turned out to be a business suite with good conditions in a hotel. There were new bedsheets, new carpets, and even the curtains had been changed. It was clean and tidy, almost the same as the one Li Nanheng lived in alone. No matter how good the conditions in the base were, this was, after all, a military training base. There was not much space for enjoyment, so even the best rooms were very simple. Feng Ling was really satisfied to have such a room of about 70 to 80 square meters for herself to live in. Moreover, whether it was the separate bathroom, study, or bedroom, the design was very thoughtful. Looking at the facilities in this room, according to the conditions of the base, Feng Ling was treated well. Li Nanheng's anger subsided a little, but only a little. The man's eyes were still a little unhappy. "Feng Ling, you can live here in the future. As for the newcomers, if you plan to move over after a period of time, wait for the new building to be cleaned up, and I will find someone to redecorate the room for you. I'm not a little girl who grew up in a princess's room. I've even slept in the mud trenches with the brothers in the base. I don't need this much," Feng Ling said as she looked out of the window. "You specially arranged a room with a balcony for me. From here, I can see the training team of the newbies and many important places in the base. The view is really good. This place is big enough. If it won't affect your work here, I can live here all the time," Feng Ling said and looked out of the window. "You specially arranged a room with a balcony for me. From here, I can see the training team of the newbies and many important places in the base. Just one bed." Boss Li, who was expressionless, had gone to the bedroom and glanced around. He found that although the space here was big enough, there was only one bed in the bedroom, and another room that could be used as a bedroom was set aside. Obviously, it was to be used as a utility room for Feng Ling. Ah Feng, Feng Ling, the 2 of them were politely discussing where to live here, but Boss Li went to study how many beds there were here. Ah Feng looked back and said, "Well, I'll ask someone to bring in another bed." Feng Ling just wanted to say no. She usually lived here alone. Why would she need a bed? Besides, this was the base hall and there were so many pairs of eyes watching her. Li Nanheng couldn't really come here every day. However, Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows slightly. "No, one bed is good, very good." Ah Feng immediately understood. He coughed and couldn't help reminding him, "Boss, this is the base after all. Don't go too far." Li Nanheng glanced at him coldly. Being stared at coldly, Ah Feng's hair stood on end and he hurriedly said, "No, no, no, boss, you can do whatever you want. I've checked it. The soundproofing here is not bad. As long as boss doesn't come here when there are many people, there shouldn't be any problem." Li Nanheng didn't speak anymore but took out a cigarette and put it in his mouth. Although he didn't say anything, his eyes and actions were clearly hinting to Ah Feng that he was redundant here now. Ah Feng immediately understood Boss Li's meaning from his cold eyes. He quickly turned back and said something to Feng Ling and quickly walked out. When he reached the door, he thought for a while and still wanted to remind Boss Li that there was not even a condom here. Feng Ling was still a drill master, and she was still young. He didn't want her to get pregnant in the base. However, on second thought, she remembered that the Li family's grandfather was worried that Feng Ling had returned to the base because she was a woman. At the same time, he was also looking forward to holding a great-grandson. She felt that there was no need for her to say anything more. Ah Feng hesitated in front of the door for more than 10 seconds, and suddenly felt a gaze from inside the door. He immediately felt a thorn in his back and quickly and decisively closed the door. Before Li Nanheng withdrew his gaze, Feng Ling went to open her suitcase and took out her things one by one. There were a lot of things she used to use in the base, but she didn't take them away in recent years. W. For M. Chapter 1188. Seeing her tidying up happily, Li Nanheng took a look at her suitcase. Most of her personal belongings were in her suitcase. She tidied up first and he turned into the bathroom with an unlit cigarette in his mouth. He checked whether the water, electricity, faucet and water heater were working well. After making sure everything was fine, he came out. When he came out, Feng Ling had already hung her clothes in the small cloakroom. Although the cloakroom was not big and was separate, it was much larger than an ordinary wardrobe. Feng Ling didn't have many clothes, and the uniform she wore here a few years ago could no longer be worn. The base would change to a new style of uniform every year, and her clothes needed to be customized. The rest were her own clothes. Most of them were sportswear, and there were loose short-sleeved or long-sleeved t-shirts, casual pants, jeans, sports pants, and all kinds of flat shoes, sneakers, or boots that she was used to wearing many years ago. But she didn't have a skirt or high heels. Everyone was used to the way she dressed over the years. If she really came out in a skirt and high heels one day, she would probably scare a lot of people, like that day when she put on a mask. She was very beautiful but would still scare a lot of people. When he saw that she even brought back the red scarf he bought in the food city that was only worth a few dozen yuan, Li Nanheng's depressed mood because she couldn't live next to him was instantly swept away. The man took the cigarette out of his mouth, clamped it between his fingers and walked over. "If there's anything else you need, just tell Ah Feng. You've heard it? He's in charge of everything inside and outside the base. Don't worry about him. If you need anything, just go to him." Feng Ling took out the red scarf from the suitcase, carefully folded it, got up, walked to the cloakroom and put it in the small cabinet inside. Then she looked back at the man who was still unwilling to give up. She walked back. "You've taken out the cigarette for a long time. Why didn't you smoke it?" "I want to quit, but I haven't," the man said lightly and looked at her. "You've just moved into this place. Even if I want to smoke, I have to go out to smoke. I can't leave secondhand smoke here." "Feng Ling, when did you treat me like an outsider? You used to smoke a lot in front of me." The man suddenly sneered as if it was because she said the word outsider. When Feng Ling was about to take more things from the suitcase, a pair of hands suddenly reached out from behind and pulled her into his arms. She paused, and before she spoke, the man bent down to press her into his arms. Even though she leaned against him, he still bent down to kiss her ear and said hoarsely, "You mean that I don't need to treat you as an outsider in the future? I can do whatever I want to you. From body to heart, from top to bottom, inside to outside, you are all mine." Feng Ling couldn't help shrinking her neck. She was trying her best to adapt to the atmosphere of making love and trying not to be the passive one, but when she was about to pack her luggage, the man suddenly became hot. She quickly shrank her neck to avoid his hot breath and said, Don't mess around. I'll pack my things." "What are you packing? These are the things you didn't plan to take with you when you left. Now you want to pack them up?" The man held her and didn't let go. His voice was close to her ear. "I didn't know you were so sentimental. Why can't I cherish the past?" Seeing that she couldn't break free, Feng Ling gave up and let the man hold her from behind. She turned to look outside the balcony. Although she knew that no one could see them, she still blushed a little. Why can't I cherish the past? Feng Ling saw that she couldn't break free and simply let the man hold her from behind. This was in the base. In the past she had always been passive in the base, and at that time her identity had never been exposed. Everything was still a blur. Now that it was all laid out on the table, such intimacy, although she did faintly like it in her heart, she still blushed. In the past, Feng Ling had never thought that she would often blush, but she found that she was often teased by this man, and sometimes she was really caught off guard. It's good to be sentimental. The man held her in his arms, and as he hugged her, he turned her body around so that she was in his arms. The fire in his eyes rose. I'll take you to make up for the training that the sniper team lacks. You only lacked the second half of the training back then, and you've already grasped the basic essentials. There's no problem, but you have to make up for what you haven't learned. You can't leave any regrets. Feng Ling didn't expect that she would have a chance to go to the sniper team to make up for the remaining training. Her eyes lit up. Really? When have I ever lied to you? Seeing her bright eyes, the man's lips were also full of smiles. The cigarette had long been thrown away, and he only hugged her tightly in his arms. Do you think that I called you back just to be an instructor for the newbies? There are more good things waiting for you. That's right. What else? Kiss me. Kiss me and I'll tell you. The man moved his chin toward her mouth. Feng Ling watched him move his chin closer and saw the triumphant smile in the man's eyes. She instinctively shrank her head back. Seeing her shrink back, Li Nanheng frowned unhappily. Didn't you say you wanted to date me and officially be my woman last time? Why are you shrinking back? Feng Ling, she was slightly embarrassed, but looking at his chin, she knew that it didn't matter if it was a good thing or not. She didn't have to know. Anyway, the base had its own arrangements. Li Nanheng would consider everything he did and wouldn't be as shameless as he was in front of her. In front of others, he was the cold, strict, and terrifying Boss Li. He wouldn't really mess around. However, looking at the man's chin, which he hadn't taken care of because he had been too busy these past few days, and seeing the green stubble, she blinked and looked at his expression. In the end, she leaned forward and kissed his chin. After kissing him, the man deliberately hugged her tightly and lowered his head to rub his chin against her face. Feng Ling grunted and struggled. In the end, the man pressed her into the sofa and Feng Ling pushed him hard. Don't. Get up, it hurts. The man didn't intend to do anything, but hearing her cry of pain, he immediately felt something was wrong. He took a deep breath, resisted the urge, and looked down at her. What hurts? Feng Ling looked at the stubble on his chin speechlessly. You're so prickly. W. For M. Chapter 1189. Is it very prickly? Hearing this, Li Nanheng raised his hand to touch his chin. After touching it, he suddenly smiled maliciously and continued to hold her and rub against the sofa. Feng Ling's body softened and she almost had no strength to resist. He lowered his head and deliberately rubbed his chin against her cheek. Try again. Do you still want to prick me? Feng Ling hurriedly moved away in pain, but because the man was holding her, she couldn't avoid it. Just when she was blushing, the man suddenly raised his wrist to look at the time, then let out a long breath, got down from under her and sat upright on the sofa. Feng Ling also quickly sat up. She didn't feel anything before, but now that she had just returned to the base, she was suddenly touched by this man here. It would be a lie to say that her heart wasn't pounding. After all, Feng Ling was a living person. No matter how hard she tried to suppress her temper and nature, she still felt her scalp tingling just thinking about it. She still felt her skin and flesh tense all over and her body was burning hot. Feng Ling, after all, was a living person. She was used to living since she was young. Even though she had suppressed her temper and nature, she still felt her scalp tingling just thinking about it. Li Nanheng said, "All right, I won't bully you anymore. Just live here. It's not inconvenient. I can find a way to avoid those people who get in the way." Feng Ling was stunned. Hearing his tone, she could tell that he was going to let it go. It was a foregone conclusion that she would live here, but just now this man still refused to leave. She thought he wanted to do something after driving Ah Feng out. After all, he had been holding back for so long. Feng Ling only felt that the place on her cheek that was deliberately rubbed by his stubble was still a little painful. The pain was not really very painful, but as if something thin and dense was drilling into her heart through her pores. She sat upright on the sofa with the man at the same time, and her voice couldn't be any softer. In fact, I can also let you bully me. Li Nanheng's eyelids suddenly twitched and he turned to look at the woman sitting next to him. She didn't know how to express her feelings, but she wanted to take the initiative to say something, lest Nanhing thought she didn't like him. She liked him very much, but she seemed to be clumsy and could only say 1 or 2 words to express that she accepted him and liked him. Even if they returned to the base, she didn't have to keep a distance every day. As long as she was appropriate, she didn't say she had to make him a vegetarian monk. But when she said this, the man suddenly touched his forehead with a headache. What's wrong? Feng Ling thought she had said something wrong and turned to look at him. The blue veins on the man's forehead bulged, but he pressed it with his hand and said with a headache, "If you want to bully me, it's not the right time." Feng Ling paused again and was silent for a while before she remembered that he seemed to have just driven back from outside. The car was still parked in front of the base hall. He must have something to talk to someone in the base hall, but he suddenly saw her at the door and then focused his attention on her. What conversation or business he was going to have was delayed until now. "Okay, I see. Then you go ahead." "I still have time today to tidy up my room," Feng Ling said softly. Li Nanheng said, "Why didn't you speak to me in such a gentle voice before?" "Feng Ling, is this gentle?" She just didn't want to be cold to him anymore. Thinking of all the good things he had done for her, she instinctively softened her voice to express her understanding of him. It was well known that he was usually very busy in the base. It was not easy to be the boss of the base. Her voice was very gentle, which showed that she didn't get angry with him because of such a trivial matter. "Okay." Hearing this, Feng Ling nodded. "Then I'll try to be gentle in the future." "Don't." Li Nanheng took his hand off his forehead and turned his eyes, which were bloodshot and slightly red. His voice was hoarse. "If you continue to be gentle, I'm afraid I won't be able to take it." Feng Ling. She immediately withdrew her eyes from the man's and understood what he meant. She was so embarrassed that she didn't know where to put her hands and feet. It was true that she couldn't help herself, but she also couldn't stand the man's undisguised words. "Stop flirting with me. You can flirt with me as much as you want after I'm done with my work. If you continue like this, I'll be able to rush out of the king's morning court session and take you out of the base. I'll let you have fun every night for at least a year or so before coming back." Feng Ling didn't say anything. She knew that since Li Nanheng could say such words, it meant that he could really do it. If it weren't for the responsibility of the base, the Li family and her feelings, this kind of thing might have played in his heart hundreds of times. "I'm not flirting with you." Feng Ling wanted to stop the topic and ask him to hurry out and do his work. After saying this, she stood up and continued to tidy up her things. This time the man didn't stop her. Instead, he watched her busy figure and rubbed his brows with a sigh and a smile. She didn't deliberately flirt with him. She didn't know that a woman who had been cold to him for many years, and a woman he had missed for many years, was the most precious thing in his heart. From being cold and not responding to him, to occasionally taking the initiative to approach him and speak softly. She was even very sensible and considerate. No man would be able to resist this, let alone Li Nanheng, who had finally found the most precious thing in his heart. Right now he couldn't wait to not be a human. He wanted to strip her on the spot and kiss her hard from head to toe. At this time he wanted her body and mind to belong to him completely. He wanted to take off his belt, tie it around her wrist and tie her to the bed. He wanted her to be bullied by him and curl up in the corner of the bed, looking at him with red eyes and begging for mercy. He wanted to do more. What else did he want to do? Right now he couldn't do it. His rationality was the last thing holding him together. If he continued to look like this, his last bit of reason would probably be gone. He glanced at the time again, got up and left. When he walked out of the door, he forced himself not to look back. If he looked back, he would see that Feng Ling was standing by the bedroom door with a piece of folded clothes in her arms. She took the opportunity to sneak a peek at his back when he went out. If he had seen Feng Ling's sweet and reluctant gaze, he definitely wouldn't have been able to walk out of this door today. Chapter 1190. He knew that when Grandfather Li asked Ah Feng to come to the base, he couldn't agree. He handed over the power of these so-called chores to Ah Feng, so it was not so easy for Li Nanheng to enter Feng Ling's room again after leaving. In particular, during the meeting it was mentioned several times that there were many newcomers in the base. The newcomers didn't know about the relationship between Boss Li and Feng Ling, nor did they know about the story of a woman disguised as a man. In order not to let those opportunistic girls who thought they could copy other people's methods sneak into the base in the future, the base didn't intend to disclose these things to the public. As for the newcomers, Ah Feng said, "Don't pollute the newcomers' understanding of the base. 11 Base is an absolutely serious military training base." Ah Feng gave an impassioned speech at the conference table, And even Han Jin and Xiao Su, who had been loyal to Li Nanheng for many years, couldn't help applauding and agreeing with this decision. Indeed, since Feng Ling had come back, they could see each other in the base every day. Boss should restrain himself. It was enough for him to meet people on the surface, but he shouldn't show off his affection all day long. In this way, those newcomers would be unbalanced. If they were unbalanced and unsteady in the early stage of the base, they would be easily eliminated. It was better to give those newcomers a good training environment. In the next few days, Li Nanheng inexplicably had a few spies around him. Even Han Jin and Xiao Su changed sides and kept an eye on him. If there was nothing serious, they wouldn't let Li Nanheng approach the base hall at will. Even when they went to the base cafeteria for lunch, Feng Ling was surrounded by a group of newcomers who had just taken over, and Li Nanheng couldn't even enter the door of the cafeteria. Xiao Su would order food for him on time every time before lunch, which was much more sumptuous than the food in the base cafeteria. He used various ways to stop Boss from showing off his affection to Feng Ling in front of the newcomers. Li Nanheng was angry. These bastards. After struggling for a few days, he found that Feng Ling had no intention of looking for him. Every day she was surrounded by a group of 18 or 19-year-old boys, calling her drill master, and drill master, and drill master, and drill master. There were even young boys who took advantage of the break to run behind her to massage her shoulders and back. At that time, Li Nanheng happened to pass by, and Xiao Su's teeth were chattering. He was afraid that Boss Li would shoot those newbies to death, so he quickly dragged them away, but after that day Boss Li's face was gloomy for the whole day. What made him even more depressed was that the woman who sat beside him in the room a few days ago and said in a very soft and small voice that he could take advantage of her, had not contacted him in the past few days. Mentoring new people is really busy, but no matter how busy he is, he won't even return a call. The next afternoon, Li Nanheng passed by the newbie base again. Xiao Su and Ah Feng said that they didn't want Boss to scare the group of newbies, so they didn't let him go over. Moreover, they were still in the training period and it was not the time for the official assessment. Boss had to maintain a sense of mystery and shouldn't casually mix with the newbies, so they repeatedly stopped him from going over. This time when he passed by, he saw the boy who ran behind Feng Ling to massage her shoulders and back, last time pouring water into Feng Ling's cup. His smile was like the sunshine of a young man, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. Obviously he liked Feng Ling very much. Even the newbies were a group of half-grown children in Li Nanheng's eyes, but the youngest of these children was only 3 years younger than Feng Ling, and their ages were not much different from hers. In the evening he finally found an opportunity to go to the canteen of the base, only to see that the boy had just helped Feng Ling get the food and put it in front of Feng Ling. Feng Ling even smiled at him. Although the smile was very polite, it was still a smile. She had always been serious, and it was said that she had been very strict in front of the newbies in recent days. Although she was a female drill master, these newbies were very afraid of her. But now she was smiling? Li Nanheng's temples throbbed. He didn't enter the canteen but pointed to the boy who was too eager. Where did this boy come from? Give me his information. Xiao Su felt that in just 3 or 4 days the low pressure around Boss Li had become terrible, so he hurriedly colluded with Han Jin and asked him to think of a way. Otherwise he felt that Boss Li would go to the newbies training team at any time. Han Jin obediently went to get the information. When he went to find Li Nanheng, he found that Boss was no longer in the canteen, but Feng Ling was still eating with the group of newbies in the canteen. Although Feng Ling didn't meet Boss Li often these days, he had to admit that in just 3 or 4 days, the group of brats under Feng Ling's command had become much more orderly and behaved in the base. They were no longer as messy as they were on the first day. It was said that on the first day, Feng Ling beat 2 particularly naughty boys to the ground on the spot, stepped on the backs of the 2 boys, and showed off her power in front of the 20 newbies expressionlessly. Who said that a female drill master was easy to bully. These newbies didn't know that in the entire base, even Boss Li didn't dare to mess with this female drill master. When Feng Ling was still training in the base, she had been serious and meticulous in her work. It was easy to imagine that those newcomers wouldn't be left casually. If any of them dared to be lazy, she could beat all 20 of them up within 15 minutes. Han Jin went to the building where Li Nanheng lived and found that Boss Li was not in the room, so he came out to look for him. Finally he saw Boss Li, who hadn't practiced shooting for a long time, wasting more than a dozen bullets on the shooting range. Boss. Tell me, who is he? Li Nanheng continued to load the gun without looking back, his voice cold. Seeing Boss's somewhat mechanical and numb posture, he was probably going to burst out of jealousy after being ignored for 3 or 4 days. Han Jin coughed and handed him the information in his hand. He is just over 19 years old. His name is Wan Ku and he has no background. He is an orphan. Hearing the word orphan, Li Nanheng suddenly stopped and turned to look at Han Jin. Chapter 1191. After all, Feng Ling was also an orphan. He grew up without parents and survived alone. When this boy first came to her, he was the one who wanted to transfer the most, because he felt that the base didn't value them and had eliminated them, Han Jin said with a smile. In the end, he was the first one to be beaten down by Feng Ling in less than 2 moves. That's right, Feng Ling was the first one to be beaten down by her in less than 2 moves. Han Jin smiled. Li Nanheng was expressionless. Very funny? Seeing Boss Li's jealous expression didn't diminish at all, Han Jin quickly stopped smiling. No, it's not funny at all. I'm just telling you what happened. Li Nanheng continued to raise the gun and his eyes were unkind. You need to rub my shoulders and wash my back? Han Jin's head hurt because of this jealousy, but he maintained an upright expression and said, yes, it's really too much. Li Nanheng didn't fire the gun in the end, but suddenly threw the gun heavily on the gun rack next to him and said coldly, newcomer, is he still a child at the age of 19? Yes, he's not a child anymore. You should be more careful. Han Jin echoed. Li Nanheng immediately glanced at him coldly. Being glanced at by Boss, Han Jin immediately felt a chill on his back and hurriedly smiled. Boss, in fact, you know Feng Ling's character. You've been chasing her for so long, but you haven't completely obeyed her yet, right? This little boy is just a flatterer. How can it be so easy to win her heart? Don't worry, it'll be fine. Why hadn't she completely obeyed him? A few days ago she was still leaning in his arms so softly. That was definitely the Feng Ling these people had never seen before. Li Nanheng felt that Feng Ling's cold and heartless heart was now filled with some normal feelings. She was a little conscious of being in love. What if she was seduced by a young man 3 years younger than her before she seriously tried to work hard on him? What should she do? Although the possibility wasn't high, he definitely trusted Feng Ling. However, since that boy was an orphan, outstanding in all aspects, and his personality was so obvious, he knew how to provoke and flatter. It was hard to guarantee that Feng Ling wouldn't find someone with a particularly active personality more suitable for her. The more he thought about it, the gloomier his face became. In the end, he simply pulled down the zipper of his uniform, took off his coat, put it in his arm and turned to leave. Seeing Boss Li's expression, Han Jin had a hunch that even if Ah Feng had 10 lives, he wouldn't be able to stop him today. Tisk, I'd better keep my mouth shut. Ever since Feng Ling took over the entire team of newcomers, she had been so busy that her head was dizzy. Dealing with this group of newcomers had taken up all her energy. Every day she had to wake up at 5 o'clock to arrange morning training. The key was that these newcomers had just come in, and the clock hadn't adjusted yet. There were often a few who were lazy in bed and didn't get up. She had to personally lift the quilt and dig them out of bed. At first they were not used to it. They never thought that a female instructor would dare to lift their quilts. Although they were all wearing clothes or at least a pair of pants, the young men who were 18 or 19 years old were still very embarrassed. After being lifted for 2 days, they consciously went to the training ground on time and did not dare to laze in bed anymore. It wasn't that Feng Ling didn't care about the difference between men and women, but because this was 11 base and she had been in the base for many years, she wasn't very sensitive to this kind of behavior that didn't cross the boundary between men and women. Even if the age difference was not big in her eyes, this group of newcomers were still children. She had considered this when she went to lift the quilt, but at most she still needed some deterrence. Otherwise, if they could even be late for morning training, what could she expect from this group of people? Just like that, she lifted the quilt, supervised them coldly and strictly, and beat them up. After 3 or 4 days, the 20 hotheads all obediently submitted to her leather boots, not daring to make a sound of resistance. In addition to waking up early in the morning, her free time was also occupied by them. They asked all sorts of questions and tried to get close to her. Even though Feng Ling always put on a cold face, she was still a woman and a beautiful woman. In their eyes, she was the noble and elegant type. Except for training, they didn't dare to provoke her. In the rest of the time, they still wanted to flatter her and try to get close to her. Although most of them failed. Only the one named Wan Ku, when he first took over this group of people, he was the happiest, but now he was smiling mischievously in front of her all day long. Feng Ling understood his situation. In many aspects, he was quite similar to her back then, so she would occasionally smile kindly at him. However, her smile was usually very short. After smiling, she would ask him to hurry back to do what he was supposed to do and not hang around in front of her anymore. It was another day when she was busy from 5 o'clock in the morning to 9:30 in the evening. It was already dark. Feng Ling settled the affairs outside and went straight back to the base hall. At this time, there should be no one else in the base hall except for the few people on patrol. Who would have thought that just as she walked to the door of the hall, before her feet could even step on the stairs, a strong force would suddenly attack her from behind. She abruptly turned her eyes in surprise, and before she could see who it was, her wrist was suddenly grabbed. Before Feng Ling had time to say anything, the patrolling people in front of the base hall clearly saw the figures of Boss Li and Feng Ling flash in front of them. After confirming that it was indeed Boss Li, they thought about it and chose to pretend not to see it for the sake of their own lives and future in the base. They all had the same idea, so they all watched Feng Ling being forcibly taken away by Boss Li, but they didn't say a word and even stood there calmly as if nothing had happened. 2 minutes later, Ah Feng came out to take a look and looked at the time with a strange look. It's strange. The newbies are so difficult to deal with today. Why hasn't Feng Ling come back yet? However, at this moment, Feng Ling's mouth was covered by the man, and she couldn't make a sound even if she wanted to speak or call for help. She was forcibly taken to a dark place behind the base hall by the man. If she hadn't confirmed that the man was Li Nanheng from his familiar smell and the familiar arms on her back, she would have pulled out the gun from her waist. At this time in the base, except for a few important places, most of the lights were off. In the open space behind the base hall, Feng Ling saw the darkness around her and her nerves all over instantly became much more sensitive. However, she was tired all day and didn't want to waste her strength to struggle. She also knew that Li Nanheng had been completely ignored by her these days. He must not be in a good mood, so she simply gave up struggling. She let the man hold her tightly in his arms in the dark and kissed her neck from behind. Chapter 1192. Feng Ling instantly trembled from the kiss, but at this moment, the man behind her hugged her even tighter. Because of the hot and wet kiss on her neck, even the tone of her voice changed when she spoke. "Boss? You still know that I'm your boss? I thought you didn't care about the entire base. You only stared at those brats every day." The man's voice came from her neck. When he spoke, his lips did not leave the skin behind her neck. When he spoke, the man's dry lips rubbed against her neck, making her itch and tremble. Feng Ling could not avoid it and could hear the dissatisfaction in the man's tone. She paused, touched the hand that was circling in front of her lower abdomen, slowly covered her hand, and was immediately held by the man. He rubbed her soft knuckles with his thumb and kissed her neck even more fiercely. If he continued kissing her, he was afraid that there would be some ambiguous marks left. She wore a combat uniform every day in the base, and the uniform was not a high-collared one. She couldn't wear something around her neck to cover those marks every day. She hurriedly elbowed his chest. When the man stopped and held her tighter, she leaned into his arms and whispered, "Be careful. This is the base after all. Even if it's dark, there may be people passing by at any time. There are so many people in the base. It's not easy to avoid people in this kind of place. You should restrain yourself." "Restrain myself?" The man hugged her tightly from behind, his voice against her ear, and he said hoarsely, "I tried everything I could to coax you back to the base. It wasn't easy for me to come back, but I was even further away from you. Those members surrounded you in the training camp all day. I didn't even have a chance to kiss or hug you, let alone relieve the heat. I finally caught you and you still want me to restrain myself?" As the man spoke, he lowered his head to take a bite of the white, tender skin connecting her neck and shoulder. Of course, the bite was not harsh or painful, but it still caused Feng Ling to shiver all over instinctively. For a moment, she also softened, but she still looked around from time to time and secretly squeezed the man's hand. "I heard footsteps, so be it. Whoever dares to peek, I'll dig his eyes out tomorrow." "Why didn't I realize that Li Nanheng was such a person?" Feng Ling hurriedly said, I'm a drill master for newcomers, right? No matter what, those young boys are all very naughty. If I want to control them, I have to establish my authority in front of them. Right now, all of them think that I'm like a cold-faced female devil, and no one dares to offend me. In this way they will listen to me and obediently train well. If they see me here with you, my newly established strict image will be completely destroyed." As she spoke, she quickly turned around in his arms and took the initiative to raise her hand to hold the man's face. She tiptoed and kissed his chin. After kissing him, she was afraid that passers-by would see her and quickly retreated. However, the man's eyes instantly darkened as he looked at her. The hand around her waist seemed to be able to pull her into his chest in an instant. There are really footsteps. Feng Ling subconsciously tilted her head to listen. Li Nanheng couldn't be bothered to care. He held her waist tightly, looked at her careful and serious expression, and then looked at her soft short hair sticking to her forehead. In the past, Feng Ling always deliberately cut her hair very short. Although she still had short hair, it was completely a woman's short hair type. Especially her hair was very soft, and when the wind gently blew, it would blow up some of her hair, making her look particularly soft and tranquil. With a warm and fragrant woman in his arms, and a woman who had clearly admitted that she was his girlfriend, any man couldn't help it. Besides, he had endured it for so many days. The man didn't say a word of nonsense and directly bent down to kiss her lips. Hearing the footsteps approaching, Feng Ling hurriedly raised her hand to cover the man's mouth. Li Nanheng immediately raised his eyebrows in displeasure and looked at her. She looked at him cautiously and begged, whispering, "Next time? Next time. This place is too close to the place where the newcomers live." Li Nanheng unhappily pulled her hand down and bent down to kiss her again. This time, Feng Ling didn't have time to dodge. Suddenly, two slightly familiar voices came from not far away. "Ah, there seems to be someone over there. Who is it?" Yes, why would someone come to the back of the base hall at this time? Hearing that it was the voices of the two newcomers in her team, Feng Ling suddenly felt as if there were thorns all over her body. She hurriedly stepped on Li Nanheng's foot hard. Li Nanheng was about to be affectionate with the little woman in front of him. Caught off guard, Li Nanheng was stepped on by her boot and glared at her with a livid face. Feng Ling hurriedly broke free from the man's arms. Before the two newcomers approached and could see who they were, she grabbed Li Nanheng's wrist hard, turned to the other side and ran forward quickly. Li Nanheng resisted the urge to turn back and shoot the two newcomers, was dragged a few steps by Feng Ling, and the two returned to the door of the base hall. There were lights and surveillance cameras in front of the door. Feng Ling carefully took 2 deep breaths, still holding Li Nanheng's wrist, and then looked back in that direction, saying softly with a sigh of relief, "Fortunately, it was too dark over there. It should be impossible for them to recognize us. I know there are a few brats in our team who like to sneak out to smoke at night when everyone is asleep." Feng Ling was really strict with these newcomers. Even if they wanted to smoke, they were not allowed to smoke indoors, so when everyone returned to their residence at night, they could only sneak out to find an empty space to smoke for a while. As a result, they bumped into each other. Seeing Feng Ling's guilty and relieved expression, under the light in front of the base hall, her eyes seemed to be sparkling with stars. Li Nanheng was originally unhappy that this kiss was interrupted, but seeing that she was more and more open in the base, no longer playing the role of a man as before, and no longer minded leaving the base, she had gradually let go of her own nature. He gradually smiled for no reason. Seeing her like this, his mood was particularly good. Feng Ling didn't notice that the man was smiling, but after temporarily leaving the two people behind, she suddenly remembered the scene just now, and this seemed to be a little embarrassing. Chapter 1193. She didn't look at the man's expression but looked at the light not far away. "Well, I've kissed you just now. Don't be angry. When I'm free, let's..." "Kissed you?" Li Nanheng pinched her chin and turned her face to look at his dissatisfied face. "When did you kiss me? Didn't I kiss you just now?" Feng Ling was forced to turn her eyes to the man's face and stared at his chin. Li Nanheng was so angry that he laughed. "You call this kissing?" After all, she knew that she had been busy with the newcomers in the past few days and had neglected Boss Li, whom she had wanted to treat well, but she had to be responsible for them. As for Li Nanheng, he was also one of them. As the boss of the base, he should be able to understand if she squeezed a little time for the newcomers. But from his expression, he was obviously very dissatisfied. Where was the noble sentiment of the boss of the base? There were surveillance cameras and lights all around. Feng Ling saw the man's expression as if he was expecting something. She hung her hands on both sides of her body for a long time and was about to touch his lips when suddenly, Ah Feng's voice came in very untimely. "You two, the base hall is such a sacred and solemn place. Don't you dare to do this?" Feng Ling, who was about to take the initiative to kiss him, suddenly felt as if she had been electrocuted. She pushed the man in front of her away and quickly left the scene. Li Nanheng, damn. He turned to look at Ah Feng, only to see that Ah Feng didn't seem to have disturbed others at all. At this time, Feng Ling ran past him quickly and entered the hall without saying a word. The base hall was indeed not a casual place. In front of the main entrance of the base hall, there was a closed glass room. Every member who sacrificed for the base would have a special name card in it. There were hundreds of name cards in it, all of which belonged to the heroes who had worked in the base for decades. Li Nanheng calmed down and walked up the stairs in front of the hall numbly, too lazy to say a word. Seeing Boss Li's sullen expression, Ah Feng asked him, "Boss, if you really can't stand it, take Feng Ling out of the base to rest for 2 days." Li Nanheng said lightly, "Thank you for your suggestion. Those newcomers have just become familiar with her, and it is the early stage of training to build the mutual trust between the drill master and the members. Now let her go out to rest for 2 days, and when she comes back, the 20 people will be like a plate of loose sand again. It means that her hard work in the past 4 days will be all in vain. You let her train those team members from morning to night, and she doesn't even have time for herself." Ah Feng said awkwardly, "It's not that I made her work so hard. You know Feng Ling's temper. Back then she was such a serious person. If she really valued something she would definitely do her best. If she wanted to get up early and work late, I couldn't stop her. Will you arrange another deputy drill master for her?" Speaking of deputy drill master, Li Nanheng frowned. "Find someone she can use. If it doesn't work, call K over. The sniper team is busy with the military exercise next month. The 4 members can't spare any time. K is one of the key trainees there, so it's impossible for him to be the deputy drill master. As for the others..." Ah Feng looked up and down at Li Nanheng. "Boss, are you sure you won't be angrier if I arrange another man to help him?" Li Nanheng turned around coldly and was about to leave. "I'm serious. If I were to poach an assistant drill master from another team to help her, she would have another close brother by her side." Ah Feng said very seriously, "Boss, if you really don't mind, I'll start to make arrangements. I guarantee that she'll be replaced tomorrow." Li Nanheng suddenly turned back and said coldly, "Do you think I'm dead? Won't you arrange me in?" The corner of Ah Feng's mouth twitched. "This is against the rules. You're the boss. The team you take over is either an elite team or a key training team like the sniper team. Many of the newcomers who haven't been screened and eliminated are ugly. Boss, if you go there you will probably be angered to death by them. Besides, now is the time for you and Feng Ling to avoid suspicion. If you help her lead the team, what will the people in the other team think of you? After all, before the screening and elimination they have to think it's fair. And this is not right, right? Why didn't Li Nanheng notice so many rules in the base before? In the past, Feng Ling was a man in everyone's eyes, so there were not so many rules. Now she was a woman, so there were more and more rules. He was the boss of the base. Every inch of this place belonged to him, but now he couldn't even hug his own woman. Seeing that Boss Li was very unhappy, Ah Feng hurriedly smiled apologetically. "How about this weekend? I'll give these newcomers a day or 2 off. Boss, you can also take these 2 days off and take Feng Ling out for a walk. I don't know how far you and Feng Ling have progressed, but it's too ambiguous to kiss each other outside the base hall. I really shouldn't do that." Li Nanheng didn't even kiss Feng Ling's lips and was suspected of being ambiguous here. He felt a little tired and left expressionlessly. Ah Feng hurriedly explained behind him, "Boss, what I said is true. Then I'll really arrange an assistant for her tomorrow." Li Nanheng paused, looked back and sneered. "Ah Feng, forget it, he would help her occasionally. If he really arranged an assistant for her, Boss Li would really eat him up." However, it turned out that Ah Feng overestimated Boss Li's trust in him. In this entire base, except for Kay, who had grown up with Feng Ling and didn't dare to have any thoughts about Feng Ling, there was really no one worthy of Li Nanheng's trust. So Boss Li thought of a very dirty way. Yes, very dirty. That was, Li Nanheng didn't reveal his identity in front of the newcomers, but directly pretended to be the drill master of the newcomers arranged by the base and went to be Feng Ling's assistant. And Boss Li also said that it was not that he had never been her assistant before, so he would arrange it in this way. Ah Feng was dumbfounded and couldn't say a word about this overly forceful decision. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.